The midnight summons came as a sharp rap on Li Chen's door, the sound cutting through the stillness of his modest courtyard home like a blade. He had been awake, as he often was at this hour, reviewing case scrolls by the flickering light of a single oil lamp. The imperial messenger's voice was flat and urgent, carrying the weight of palace authority that brooked no delay. Li Chen rose, his movements deliberate. He dressed in his official investigator's robes, the dark blue fabric worn at the edges from years of service. As he fastened the sash, he glanced toward the sleeping quarters where his wife and young daughter lay. The thought of them sleeping peacefully, unaware of what this summons might mean, tightened his chest. He had learned long ago that midnight calls to the palace rarely brought good news. The journey through the sleeping capital was a silent one. The streets were empty save for the occasional patrol, their lanterns casting long, wavering shadows against the closed shop fronts and silent homes. The palanquin bearers moved with practiced efficiency, their footsteps barely audible on the stone paving. Li Chen watched the city pass by through the curtain's gap, his mind already turning over possibilities. A senior official dead, the messenger had said. Found in his chambers. No details beyond that. When they passed through the palace gates, the atmosphere shifted. Torches burned along the walls, their flames dancing in the night breeze. The air grew colder, carrying the scent of incense and something else, a metallic tang that Li Chen recognized immediately. Blood. He stepped from the palanquin, his boots meeting the polished stone of the courtyard. Two eunuchs waited for him, their faces pale in the torchlight. Investigator Li, the taller eunuch said, his voice a whisper that seemed to catch in his throat. This way. The Grand Secretary, it is not a sight for faint hearts. They led him through a series of corridors, past guards who stood like statues, their eyes fixed ahead. The whispers began as they approached the Grand Secretary's chambers. Court officials clustered in small groups, their robes rustling as they spoke in hushed tones. Li Chen caught fragments of their conversation as he passed. Drained of all blood, yet not a drop on the floor. The silk they found him wrapped in, it shimmered like moonlight. Cursed, I tell you. The spirits have returned. The door to the chambers stood open. Inside, the room was lit by dozens of candles, their light revealing a scene that would haunt any man's dreams. Grand Secretary Zhang lay on his bed, his body arranged as if in sleep. But the pallor of his skin told the true story, a waxy, grayish white that spoke of complete exsanguination. Draped over him was a length of silk so fine it seemed to float above his form, its surface catching the candlelight in eerie, shifting patterns. The fabric was the color of old bone, and it moved with a life of its own in the slight draft from the doorway. Li Chen approached slowly, his training overriding the instinctive revulsion that rose in his throat. He noted the details with a detached precision. The room showed no signs of struggle. The writing desk in the corner stood orderly, brushes arranged neatly beside an unfinished memorial to the throne. A cup of cold tea sat on a small table near the bed. The windows were latched from the inside. When was he found? Li Chen asked without turning. Just before the midnight watch change, one of the eunuchs answered. His servant came to deliver evening tea and found him, like this. The other eunuch added, his voice trembling slightly, they say it's the ghost silk curse, investigator. The same way Minister Wang was found last month. No wounds. No blood. Just, empty. Li Chen nodded, his eyes never leaving the body. He had heard the rumors, of course. Whispers of vengeful spirits taking high officials in the night, leaving them wrapped in cursed silk as a warning to the living. Superstition, he had thought. Now, standing before the evidence, he felt the weight of those rumors pressing in around him. Leave me, he said quietly. I need to examine the scene alone. The eunuchs exchanged glances but obeyed, backing out of the room and closing the door behind them. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the soft hiss of the candles. Li Chen took a deep breath, centering himself. This was the moment he both dreaded and needed. He closed his eyes, reaching for that forbidden place in his mind, the forensic memory palace. It was not a physical space, but a construct of perfect recollection, a cheat against the limitations of mortal memory that he had discovered years ago and kept hidden ever since. He opened his eyes, and the room transformed. In his mind's eye, the scene reconstructed itself with impossible clarity. Every detail magnified, every element frozen in time as it had been when he first entered. The memory palace did not create new information, it only preserved what he had observed with perfect fidelity. But that fidelity allowed him to examine things in ways no ordinary investigator could. He walked the mental reconstruction slowly, his physical body standing motionless by the bed. In the memory palace, he could focus on individual elements without distraction. He examined the silk first. In the enhanced mental view, he could see the weave was not merely fine, it was extraordinary, each thread thinner than a human hair, woven in a pattern that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. No ordinary silk. No ordinary curse. Then he turned his attention to the body. In the physical world, Grand Secretary Zhang appeared unmarked. But in the memory palace, Li Chen could focus his mental gaze with surgical precision. He started at the head, working downward. The face showed no signs of distress, the expression was peaceful, almost serene. The hands lay at the sides, fingers relaxed. No defensive wounds. No bruising. It was when he reached the neck that he found it. 3 tiny punctures, almost invisible to the naked eye, arranged in a perfect triangle just below the left ear. They were so small they might have been mistaken for pores or minor skin imperfections. But in the memory palace's perfect reconstruction, Li Chen could see their true nature, needle marks, precise and deliberate. And around them, a faint discoloration of the skin, a slight bluish tinge that spoke of something introduced beneath the surface. He leaned closer in his mental examination, though his physical body remained still. There, clinging to the edge of one puncture, was a residue so minute it would have been missed by any normal inspection. A crystalline substance, amber in color, catching the candlelight in his memory palace view. He recognized it, or rather, he recognized its type. A botanical extract, rare and expensive. Not something a common assassin would possess. Li Chen opened his eyes, returning to the physical world. The transition left him momentarily dizzy, a familiar side effect of the memory palace's strain on his mind. He steadied himself against the bedpost, his breathing slightly labored. Toxin. Delivered via needle to a pressure point that would induce rapid unconsciousness while allowing the poison to work. The exsanguination was secondary, likely achieved through some mechanical means after death to create the supernatural appearance. And the silk was theater. A prop to feed the rumors, to steer investigation toward spirits rather than schemers. This was no ghost story. This was murder. Political murder. He heard the door open behind him. The eunuchs had returned, accompanied by a senior palace official whose robes marked him as a deputy minister. The man's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes held a calculating sharpness. Investigator Li, the deputy minister said. Your assessment. Li Chen straightened, masking the fatigue that tugged at his thoughts. He had to choose his words with the precision of a surgeon's blade. The truth would be dangerous. If this murder was political, then those behind it had power. And power in the Imperial Court meant connections, influence, the ability to make inconvenient investigators disappear. But he had a family. A wife who still smiled when he returned home late. A daughter who asked him about his day as if he were simply a clerk, not a man who walked among the dead and the deadly. Grand Secretary Zhang has fallen victim to restless spirits, Li Chen said, his voice carrying just the right note of solemn certainty. The signs are clear. The silk, the absence of blood, the peaceful countenance, these are the marks of supernatural intervention. I recommend the appropriate rituals be performed to appease the spirits and prevent further occurrences. The deputy minister's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes seemed to settle. A spiritual matter, then. The court will be relieved to hear it. Your report will be expected by morning. Of course, Li Chen said. He made his final notations, careful observations that omitted the needle marks and residue, focusing instead on the positioning of the body, the quality of the silk, the atmosphere of the room. When he was done, he bowed to the deputy minister and took his leave. The walk back through the palace felt longer than the journey in. The whispers had grown louder, spreading through the corridors like poison in water. Ghost silk. Curses. Vengeful spirits. Li Chen kept his face impassive, but his mind worked furiously. That botanical residue, he had seen references to something similar in restricted medical texts. A compound derived from a rare mountain flower that grew only in specific regions, one of which was under the control of. He stopped himself. Not here. Not where walls might have ears. When he finally stepped out into the night air, the fatigue hit him fully. Using the memory palace always drained him, and tonight's session had been particularly intense. His head throbbed with a dull ache, and his thoughts felt sluggish, as if moving through honey. He signaled for his palanquin, leaning against a pillar while he waited. The bearers arrived quickly, their faces shadowed in the dim light. Li Chen climbed in, sinking onto the cushions with a sigh that was part exhaustion, part relief at being away from the palace's watching eyes. As the palanquin began to move, he closed his eyes, letting the rhythmic motion soothe his pounding head. It was only when they were halfway home that he noticed the slight rustle of paper. Frowning, he reached into his sleeve and found a folded note that hadn't been there before. The paper was of fine quality, smooth and heavy in his fingers. He unfolded it, holding it up to catch the moonlight filtering through the palanquin's curtain. The characters were written in a precise, elegant hand, but the message was anything but elegant. Your family sleeps soundly tonight. Will they tomorrow? Li Chen's blood went cold. He stared at the words, reading them again and again as if they might change. Then he crumpled the note in his fist, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. He leaned out of the palanquin, scanning the dark streets, but saw only shadows and the retreating back of a figure disappearing into an alleyway. Faster, he said to the bearers, his voice tight. Get me home. Now. The palanquin picked up speed, but the journey had never felt so long. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every sound a potential danger. Li Chen kept his hand on the hilt of his short sword, his eyes never still. The note burned in his mind, each word a brand. When they finally reached his courtyard, he practically leaped from the palanquin before it had fully settled. He rushed to the door, his heart pounding in a rhythm that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The lock was undisturbed. The windows were intact. He entered quietly, moving first to the sleeping quarters. His wife lay on her side, her breathing deep and regular. Their daughter was curled in her own small bed, one hand tucked under her cheek. Both were safe. Unharmed. Sleeping soundly, just as the note had said. Li Chen stood in the doorway, watching them for a long moment. Then he turned away, retreating to his study. He lit a single candle and smoothed out the crumpled note on his desk, weighing it down with an inkstone. The characters seemed to glow in the flickering light, a promise and a threat in equal measure. He had thought he was playing a careful game, balancing truth and safety. But someone knew. Someone had been watching closely enough to slip a note into his sleeve without him noticing. Someone who knew where he lived, who his family was. The investigation had just become personal. And the rules had changed. The heavy wooden gate of Li Chen's courtyard groaned shut behind him, the sound swallowed by the pre-dawn darkness. He leaned against the rough-hewn planks for a moment, the cold seeping through his official robes, feeling the weight of the palace's stone corridors still clinging to his bones. Inside the courtyard, a single lantern burned in the main hall's window, a small, wavering eye of light that did nothing to dispel the shadows pooling between the buildings. He crossed the courtyard slowly, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The air smelled of damp earth and the faint, sweet scent of plum blossoms from the tree near the study, a scent that usually brought him peace. Tonight, it felt like a memory of something already lost. The door to the main hall opened before he reached it. His wife, Mei Ling, stood silhouetted against the lamplight, her hands clasped tightly before her. She wore a simple sleeping robe, her hair loose about her shoulders, but her eyes were wide and awake. "You're home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Li Chen stepped inside, the warmth of the room washing over him. Two small forms huddled on a cushion near the brazier, his children, 8-year-old An and 6-year-old Xiao, wrapped in blankets. Their faces were pale in the firelight, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of fear and relief. "What's happening, father?" An asked, his voice trembling. "The neighbors said you were called to the palace because a ghost killed someone." Li Chen knelt before them, the motion stiff from exhaustion. He placed a hand on each child's head, feeling the fine silk of their hair beneath his fingers. "There are no ghosts," he said, keeping his voice steady. "Only men who wish others to believe in them." Mei Ling moved to stand behind the children, her hands resting on their shoulders. "Rumors are spreading through the capital," she said quietly. "They say Grand Secretary Zhang was taken by vengeful spirits, and that you've been tasked with appeasing them. Some whisper that anyone who touches this case will be cursed." Li Chen looked up at her. In the flickering light, he could see the tightness around her mouth, the way her knuckles whitened where she gripped the children's shoulders. She knew, without him saying a word, that this was more than superstition. She had lived through court intrigues before, had seen friends disappear after speaking too freely. The children should sleep, he said gently. Mei Ling nodded, her expression unreadable. She shepherded An and Xiao toward their bedroom, her murmured assurances fading down the hallway. Li Chen remained kneeling for a moment longer, listening to the crackle of the brazier, feeling the silence of the house press in around him. When he rose, his joints protested. The use of the memory palace always left him drained, not just tired, but hollowed out, as if he'd poured part of his essence into reconstructing those frozen moments. He made his way to his study, a small room at the back of the house lined with scrolls and treatises on medicine, law, and botany. He lit a second lantern, the flame catching on the polished surface of his writing desk. From an inner pocket of his robe, he withdrew a small silk pouch. Inside, carefully folded in oiled paper, were the scrapings he'd taken from Grand Secretary Zhang's neck, minuscule traces of botanical residue, no larger than a grain of sand. Li Chen placed the paper on the desk, smoothing it flat with his fingertips. Then he closed his eyes. The memory palace unfolded around him, not as a physical space, but as a layered constructive perception. He didn't see walls or corridors, instead, he felt the texture of the palace floor beneath his feet, smelled the faint metallic scent of blood mixed with incense, heard the distant drip of water from a leaky eave. And superimposed over it all, perfect in every detail, was the image of Grand Secretary Zhang's body. He focused on the neck. In his mind's eye, the 3 needle marks appeared, tiny punctures, almost invisible to the naked eye. He zoomed in further, past skin and tissue, to the molecular level where the residue clung. The memory palace allowed him to examine it from every angle, to separate its components with impossible precision. The residue was pale green, crystalline under mental magnification. It had a peculiar structure, layered like petals, with a central core that glowed faintly in the reconstructed light. Li Chen compared it to the botanical knowledge stored in his memory, treatises on poisonous plants, imperial records of rare cultivations, his own observations from years of investigation. It matched only one thing, Silent Lotus. The name came to him with chilling certainty. Silent Lotus, Nymphea taciturna, was a hybrid species, created through careful crossbreeding of water lilies and a rare mountain orchid. Its petals, when dried and powdered, produced a toxin that paralyzed the nervous system and prevented blood from clotting. A victim injected with it would bleed out internally through microscopic vessels, leaving no external wounds, exactly what he'd seen with Grand Secretary Zhang. But more importantly, Silent Lotus was notoriously difficult to cultivate. It required specific soil acidity, controlled water temperature, and shade at precise hours of the day. According to imperial records, only 3 gardens in the entire capital maintained the conditions necessary: the Imperial Botanical Gardens, the Temple of Heavenly Harmony's medicinal plots, and the private gardens of the Minister of War. Li Chen's eyes snapped open. The lantern flame wavered, casting long shadows across the scrolls on his walls. His breath came in shallow gasps, sweat beaded on his forehead. Using the memory palace for such fine analysis was like holding a boulder overhead. The mental strain made his temples throb with a dull, persistent ache. He looked down at the scrapings on the desk. Proof. Tangible, physical proof that connected the murder to one of the most powerful men in the empire. The Minister of War, brother to the Empress, commander of the imperial armies. Reporting this would be like throwing himself and his family onto a funeral pyre. Carefully, Li Chen folded the oiled paper again, sealing the residue inside. He placed it in a hidden compartment beneath his desk floorboard, a space he'd carved out years ago, lined with lead to mask scent. Then he sat back in his chair, staring at the wall without seeing it. He needed to investigate further. He needed to see the minister's gardens for himself, to confirm the cultivation. But he couldn't go as an investigator hunting evidence, that would draw immediate suspicion. He needed a pretext. An idea formed, slow and careful. As Imperial Investigator, he had authority to conduct routine inspections of noble estates for security and compliance with imperial edicts. It was a rarely used privilege, but it existed in the legal codes. He could visit the minister's estate under that guise, a cursory check of perimeter walls, a glance at the gardens in passing. Nothing that would alarm anyone who wasn't already watching. Li Chen stood, his legs unsteady. He extinguished the lantern and left the study, moving through the dark house to the bedroom. Mei Ling lay awake on the sleeping mat, her eyes reflecting the moonlight filtering through the paper window. "You're going out again," she said, not a question. "Routine inspection," he murmured, lying down beside her. "Nothing to worry about." She turned to face him, her hand finding his in the darkness. Her fingers were cold. "Be careful," she whispered. He didn't sleep. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. Dawn painted the capital in shades of gray and gold. Li Chen dressed in his official robes, dark blue silk with silver threading, the badge of his office pinned at his collar. He ate breakfast with the children, forcing himself to make conversation about their lessons, about the plum tree's blossoms, about anything except the tension thickening the air. When he left the house, the streets were already coming alive. Vendors called out their wares, porters hurried past with loads balanced on poles, a group of scholars debated loudly outside a tea house. Li Chen walked with measured steps, his face a mask of bureaucratic calm. But his eyes missed nothing, the way a fruit seller watched him a beat too long, the sudden silence that fell over a group of washerwomen as he passed, the distant figure on a rooftop that might have been a guard or might have been a trick of the light. The Minister of War's estate stood in the northern quarter of the capital, surrounded by high walls of whitewashed stone. Twin lion statues flanked the main gate, their stone mouths frozen in silent roars. Guards in polished armor stood at attention, their spears gleaming in the morning sun. Li Chen presented his credentials to the captain of the guard, a broad-shouldered man with a scar across his cheek. "Imperial Investigator Li Chen," he said, his voice flat and official. "Routine security inspection, as per Edict 47 of the Imperial Code." The captain examined the seal, his expression unreadable. "The minister is not receiving visitors today." "I don't need to see the minister," Li Chen replied. "Just a walk around the perimeter, a check of the outer gardens." "Standard procedure." A moment of hesitation. Then the captain nodded and stepped aside. "Escort him," he said to one of the guards. A young guard fell into step beside Li Chen as they passed through the gate. The estate unfolded before them, manicured pathways, ornamental ponds, pavilions with upturned eaves. It was beautiful in a severe, calculated way, every tree perfectly placed, every rock in the dry garden positioned according to some unseen geometry. Li Chen walked slowly, making notes on a wax tablet. "Wall integrity appears good," he murmured, as if to himself. "Gate mechanisms functional." They rounded a corner, and the gardens proper came into view. Terraced plots descended toward an artificial stream, each level filled with carefully arranged plants. Li Chen's heart beat faster, but he kept his pace even, his expression bored. He spotted them near the water's edge, a cluster of lotus plants with unusual, pale green paths. They grew in a separate pond, its water murky with special nutrients. Even from a distance, he could see the distinctive layered structure of the leaves, exactly as they'd appeared in his memory palace reconstruction. Silent lotus. Growing here, in the minister's private garden. Cultivated, tended, harvested. Li Chen made a show of examining the estate's outer wall, running a hand along the stone. "Some weathering here," he said to the guard. "Might want to have it looked at before the rainy season." The guard nodded, his attention seemingly elsewhere. But as Li Chen turned to continue his inspection, he caught the man's eyes flicking toward the lotus pond, then back to him. Too quick. Too deliberate. They completed the circuit of the estate. Li Chen made more meaningless notes, asked a few procedural questions, all while his mind raced. The evidence was here. The connection was real. But how to document it without alerting anyone? How to? He stopped walking. At the edge of the garden, partially hidden by a decorative screen of bamboo, stood another guard. This one wasn't watching the perimeter, he was watching Li Chen. His posture was too still, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword not in readiness, but in anticipation. Li Chen turned away, pretending to examine a flowering shrub. "I think that covers everything," he said to his escort, keeping his voice casual. "Thank you for your time." He began walking back toward the gate, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. The estate seemed suddenly too quiet, the birds had stopped singing, the breeze had died. Even the stream's murmur seemed muted. Halfway to the gate, Li Chen heard it. A faint click from the shadows of a nearby pavilion. Metallic, precise. The sound of a crossbow being loaded. He didn't turn. Didn't run. He kept walking, each step measured and calm, but his blood turned to ice in his veins. The gate seemed impossibly far away, the white walls looming like the sides of a tomb. The click echoed in the silence, hanging in the air like a promise. The click echoed in the stillness of the Minister of War's gardens, a sound Li Chen recognized instantly from his training, a crossbow's mechanism being drawn taut. His body reacted before his mind could fully process the threat. He dropped to the ground, rolling behind the thick trunk of an ancient pine tree just as a bolt whistled through the air where his head had been moments before. It embedded itself in the tree with a dull thud, the fletching vibrating with residual energy. Li Chen pressed himself against the rough bark, his breathing deliberately controlled. His heart hammered against his ribs, but his training took over. He listened. Footsteps retreated through the gravel path, light and hurried. Not a guard's heavy tread, someone trained in stealth. The conspirators weren't just watching him, they were willing to kill him right here on the minister's property. The boldness of it chilled him more than the evening air. He waited a full 5 minutes, counting each second, before peering around the tree. The gardens appeared empty again, the pavilion's shadows now just ordinary darkness. The crossbow bolt remained lodged in the pine, its iron tip glinting in the fading light. Li Chen didn't remove it. Evidence left behind might be traced, but removing it would alert his attacker that he'd survived. Better to let them wonder. As he straightened his robes, his mind raced. The ambush confirmed his worst fears, the Minister of War's faction knew he was investigating beyond the spiritual explanation. They'd allowed him into the gardens, watched him examine the silent lotus, and then tried to eliminate him. The message was clear, stop now, or die. But the attempt had also revealed something crucial. They were nervous enough to risk killing an Imperial investigator on their own grounds. That meant he was getting close to something they couldn't afford to have exposed. Li Chen walked back toward the main estate buildings, his steps measured despite the adrenaline still coursing through him. 2 guards stood at the garden's entrance, their expressions carefully neutral. He noted their positions, the way their hands rested on their sword hilts, the slight tension in their shoulders. They'd heard the crossbow. They knew. And they'd done nothing. Your inspection is complete, investigator, one guard asked, his voice flat. For now, Li Chen replied, keeping his tone equally devoid of emotion. The minister's security appears adequate, though I recommend additional patrols near the western wall. The shadows there are, deep. He watched their reactions. The guard who'd spoken gave a barely perceptible nod, while the other's eyes flickered toward the pavilion. Li Chen filed the observation away. Every detail mattered now. Returning to his residence took twice as long as usual. He took circuitous routes through crowded market streets, doubling back twice, watching reflections in shop windows for anyone following. The threatening note from Chapter 1 had been a warning. Today's ambush was an escalation. They were testing his resolve, seeing how far he'd go before breaking. His study felt like both sanctuary and prison when he finally locked the door behind him. The familiar scent of ink and old paper usually calmed him, but tonight it only emphasized how isolated he was. His family slept in the adjoining rooms, unaware that their lives balanced on the edge of a blade sharper than any assassin's. Li Chen lit a single oil lamp, the flame casting long, dancing shadows across the room. He sat at his desk, closed his eyes, and began the process he both relied on and dreaded. The forensic memory palace unfolded in his mind. First, the gardens. Every detail he'd observed today reconstructed itself with unnatural clarity. The layout of paths, the positions of plants, the silent lotus specimens with their distinctive blue-veined leaves. Then he added the guards, their patrol routes, their watching positions, the moments when their attention had been elsewhere. He mapped their movements over the hours he'd been there, tracing patterns in the air like invisible threads. His head began to throb almost immediately, a familiar pressure building behind his eyes. The memory palace demanded payment for its perfection. But he pushed through, focusing on the anomalies. One guard had circled a particular storage shed 3 times in 2 hours, always pausing at the same spot. Another had conspicuously avoided the area near the pavilion after the ambush attempt. Li Chen visualized the storage shed in minute detail. Wooden walls, iron-banded door, a lock that appeared ordinary but showed minimal wear, as if rarely opened. But the ground around it. He reconstructed the packed earth, the slight depression leading to the door where feet had trodden repeatedly. And there, near the foundation, a patch of discolored soil where something had been spilled and hastily covered. He zoomed in mentally, the memory palace allowing him to examine what his physical eyes had only glanced at. The soil was darker, with a faint crystalline sheen when light hit it at certain angles. Toxin residue. Not Silent Lotus, something else. A storage area for poisons, hidden in plain sight among gardening supplies. The headache intensified, sharpening into a stabbing pain that made him grip the edge of his desk. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He'd pushed too far, too fast after the ambush's adrenaline had drained him. But he couldn't stop now. He needed to document this before the memory palace's clarity faded. With trembling hands, he unrolled a sheet of paper and began sketching. Not the actual layout, that would be too dangerous if discovered. Instead, he created what appeared to be spiritual diagrams, circles and symbols that could be mistaken for exorcism patterns. But hidden within them were the true coordinates, the shed's location relative to the main house, the guard patrol gaps, the soil discoloration. He labeled them with coded references only he would understand. Azure Dragon's third eye, for the Silent Lotus patch. Broken Earth at White Tiger's paw for the toxin storage. Shadowed Serpent for the ambush point. The system was based on the 4 symbols, twisted to serve forensic purposes rather than celestial ones. As he worked, the headache became blinding. Nausea rose in his throat. The memory palace was collapsing now, the perfect reconstruction dissolving into fragmented images. He forced himself to finish the last symbol, then dropped the brush, ink splattering across the paper like blood. For the rest of that day and through the night, Li Chen lay in his bedchamber with curtains drawn, unable to bear light or sound. The headache was a living thing inside his skull, pulsing with every heartbeat. His wife brought him broth, her face etched with worry he couldn't soothe with explanations. His children whispered in the hallway, told their father was working. He drifted in and out of consciousness, the memory palace's aftermath leaving him vulnerable. In his fevered state, he kept seeing the crossbow bolt flying toward him, the guard's neutral expression, the minister's gardens blooming with deadly flowers. Each time he jerked awake, the pain renewed itself. By the next morning, the worst had passed to a dull, persistent ache behind his eyes. He rose, washed, and dressed in his official robes. The fabricated report needed to be delivered today, before anyone grew suspicious of his silence. At the Ministry of Justice, he presented his findings to the reviewing magistrate. The man was elderly, more concerned with protocol than truth, which suited Li Chen perfectly. The death of Grand Secretary Zhang exhibits clear signs of spiritual disturbance, Li Chen announced, keeping his voice steady despite the residual headache. The silk drapery matches descriptions from the Classic of Hauntings, Chapter 7. The lack of wound suggests soul drainage, not physical violence. I recommend ritual cleansing of his residence and posthumous honors to appease any restless energy. He laid out his evidence, carefully selected observations stripped of their forensic meaning. The silk's unusual weave became ghost loom pattern. The body's pallor became energy depletion. Even the needle marks, mentioned only in passing, were attributed to spiritual acupuncture points used in necromantic rituals. The magistrate nodded along, making notes. And the botanical residue you mentioned in your initial examination? Incense ash, Li Chen lied smoothly. From improper funeral rites performed by his household. I've already instructed them in correct procedures. The fabrication tasted bitter on his tongue. Every word felt like a betrayal of his duty, of the truth he'd sworn to uphold. But duty to truth meant nothing if it got his family executed. Grand Secretary Zhang was already dead, Li Chen's wife and children were still alive. The magistrate stamped the report with the ministry seal. Approved. The court will be pleased to have this matter settled. These ghost rumors were becoming disruptive. Li Chen bowed, hiding his expression. Settled. As if murder could ever be settled with lies. He returned home as evening fell, the fabricated report delivered, the real evidence hidden in his coded diagrams. For a moment, standing in his courtyard watching his children play with a wooden ball, he allowed himself to believe it might work. He could publicly endorse the supernatural explanation while secretly building a case so airtight that not even the Minister of War could escape it. A delicate balance, but possible. Then, as he turned to enter his study, he saw it. A small scroll case lay on his desk, where nothing had been when he left. No seal, no identifying marks. Just plain bamboo. His hands were steady as he opened it, but cold dread pooled in his stomach. The message inside was brief, written in elegant, anonymous calligraphy. The next body will be someone you know. Stop digging. He read it 3 times, each repetition tightening the knot in his chest. Not a threat against him this time. Against someone he knew. A colleague? A friend? Family? Li Chen's eyes went to the doorway where his wife was calling the children inside for dinner. Her laughter floated through the house, innocent of the danger he'd brought to their doorstep. The coded diagrams suddenly felt worthless. What good was evidence if it got them killed before he could use it? He burned the message in the oil lamp's flame, watching the characters blacken and curl to ash. The smell of burnt paper mixed with the evening's cooking smells from the kitchen. Normal life, continuing around him while shadows closed in. Outside, the first stars appeared in the twilight sky. Somewhere in the capital, the conspirators were planning their next move. And the next body was already chosen. The morning mist clung to the capital like a shroud, damp and cold against Li Chen's skin as he hurried through the palace gates. He'd been summoned before dawn, the urgency in the messenger's voice cutting through his fitful sleep. The nightmares had returned, visions of silk-wrapped bodies and silent lotus blooms that seemed to whisper his family's names. At the Ministry of Justice, Deputy Minister Wang, a man with perpetually narrowed eyes and ink-stained fingers, met him with a grim expression. Another one, Wang said without preamble, his voice low. Assistant Minister Zhao of the Ministry of Revenue. Found in the Temple of Heavenly Peace just before the midnight watch. Li Chen's stomach tightened. Assistant Minister Zhao was a mid-level official, not as senior as Grand Secretary Zhang, but his position in revenue meant he oversaw military supply allocations. The connection to the Minister of War's domain was too obvious to ignore. The same markings? Li Chen asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Wang's eyes darted around the empty corridor before he leaned closer. Silk. No wounds. But this time. He lowered his voice further. The temple priests say they heard chanting before they found him. Now the whole court is whispering about angry gods. They're escalating, Li Chen thought. Testing how far they can push the supernatural narrative. The Temple of Heavenly Peace stood at the capital's northern edge, its curved roofs piercing the gray morning sky like stone claws. Imperial guards had cordoned off the entire complex, their armor gleaming dully in the weak light. A crowd of onlookers pressed against the barriers, their murmurs rising like the buzz of disturbed insects. Li Chen caught fragments of conversation, divine punishment, cursed silk, the emperor's favor withdrawn. Inside the temple courtyard, the air smelled of incense and something metallic beneath it. Assistant Minister Zhao lay on the stone paving before the main altar, his body arranged with deliberate care. Crimson silk, the exact shade Li Chen remembered from Grand Secretary Zhang's death, draped over him like a funeral shroud. The silk pooled around his limbs, one corner caught by the morning breeze that made it ripple like liquid blood. 2 temple priests stood nearby, their saffron robes contrasting starkly with the scene. The older one, Masterin, had deep lines around his eyes that spoke of decades of meditation, but now his hands trembled slightly as he held his prayer beads. The younger, novice Bao, couldn't stop staring at the body, his face pale. "We found him just as you see," Masterin said, his voice thin. The doors were locked from within. Only the high windows. He gestured upward to the temple's latticework openings, too small for a man to pass through. Li Chen knelt beside the body, the cold stone seeping through his robes. He took a slow breath, preparing himself. The forensic memory palace demanded focus, and the mental strain from his previous investigation still lingered like a bruise behind his eyes. He closed his eyes. The world dissolved into darkness, then reformed with crystalline precision. In his mind, the temple courtyard reconstructed itself, every stone, every shadow, every fold of silk. Time rewound. The body lifted from the ground, the silk unwrapping itself. Assistant Minister Zhao stood before the altar, his back to the main hall. In the memory palace, Li Chen walked around him, examining every angle. The silk in the reconstruction wasn't just draped, it had been wrapped with specific patterns, the ends tucked with ritual precision. On Zhao's neck, 3 needle marks appeared, identical to Zhang's. But as Li Chen leaned closer in his mental space, new details emerged. Bruising. Faint discoloration along Zhao's shoulders and upper back, forming patterns that matched pressure points, the Jianjing points between neck and shoulder, the Tianzhu points at the base of the skull. Someone had applied precise pressure before administering the toxin. The technique spoke of martial training, not just poison craft. Li Chen opened his eyes, the real world rushing back with a wave of dizziness. He steadied himself against the cold stone. The headache began immediately, a sharp pain behind his right temple. Master Investigator. Novice Bao asked, concern in his young voice. The incense, Li Chen murmured, covering his reaction. It's stronger than I'm used to. He examined the actual body now, his physical observations confirming what the memory palace had shown. The pressure point bruising was barely visible to the naked eye, but it was there, yellowish-purple shadows beneath the skin. And when he carefully lifted a corner of the silk, he found what he'd suspected, a different botanical residue, this one powdery and pale blue where Zhang's had been green-tinged. A variant, he thought. They're using different toxins for different victims. He scraped a minute sample into a wax-sealed paper pouch from his sleeve, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The priests watched, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and fear. What do you see? Master An asked quietly. Li Chen rose, his knees protesting the cold stone. He looked from the body to the temple's main hall, where statues of deities watched with stone eyes. The court would want answers. The people would demand explanations. And the conspirators would be listening. The silk, he said, his voice carrying just enough to reach the guards at the courtyard entrance. It bears the same markings as Grand Secretary Zhang's. The arrangement. He gestured to the precise folds. This is ritual. Ceremonial. Master N's eyes widened. You believe it's divine punishment, Li Chen finished, the words tasting like ash. Assistant Minister Zhao oversaw the famine relief funds for the northern provinces. The records showed discrepancies. This was true, he'd checked Zhao's background while riding to the temple. The heavens notice such things. The priests exchanged glances. Novice Bao looked relieved, as if the supernatural explanation was preferable to the alternative, that men could do this to other men within a locked temple. But in Li Chen's mind, connections were forming. Pressure point techniques suggested someone with medical or martial training. The different toxin variant pointed to a different source than the Minister of War's Silent Lotus. The rival noble houses, particularly the House of Wei, who controlled several apothecaries and had physicians in their employ, used blue-tinged compounds in their traditional medicines. Multiple factions, he realized with growing dread. This isn't one plot. It's several, converging. The Minister of War might be eliminating military oversight, while the rival houses removed financial obstacles. They were using the same method, the same cover story, but different tools. A conspiracy of convenience rather than unity. The headache intensified, throbbing in time with his heartbeat. Using the memory palace twice in 3 days was pushing his limits. He could feel the mental fatigue like a weight on his thoughts, slowing his deductions. Back at his office that afternoon, Li Chen lit a single candle and unrolled a blank scroll. His coded journal, based on the 4-symbol system he'd developed, would record today's findings. With a fine brush, he began painting symbols that looked like decorative borders to any casual observer. Azure Dragon for the Minister of War and Silent Lotus. White Tiger for the rival houses and pressure point techniques. Vermilion Bird for the temple location and locked room mystery. Black Tortoise for the blue toxin variant and financial connections. Each symbol contains smaller marks indicating specifics, the exact pressure points used, the temple's layout, the type of silk, the time of death estimated from body temperature and rigor. He worked for hours, the candle burning low, his head pounding until tears blurred his vision. When he finished, he sealed the scroll with wax impressed with his official chop, but the impression was deliberately smudged, a signal to himself that this was a coded document. He hid it behind a loose brick in his study wall, alongside his notes from Zhang's murder. The mental exhaustion hit him then, a wave of dizziness so severe he had to grip his desk to remain standing. Colors swam at the edges of his vision. He remembered his teacher's warning years ago, when he'd first discovered his ability, the mind is not meant to hold so much detail. Each reconstruction takes something from you, He splashed water on his face from a basin, the cold shock bringing momentary clarity. But the vulnerability remained, a fog over his thoughts, a slowness in his reactions. In this state, he was an easy target. Evening was falling when he returned to the Temple of Heavenly Peace to collect his official report from the guards. The crowd had dispersed, leaving the streets quiet. Torches flickered in brackets along the temple wall, casting long, dancing shadows. As he turned to leave, a figure emerged from the deepening gloom near the side gate. It was a eunuch, older, with a face lined like cracked porcelain and eyes that held no expression. His palace robes were plain, without rank markings. He moved with the silent grace of someone who'd spent decades learning not to be noticed. "Master Investigator," the eunuch said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't bow. Li Chen's hand went instinctively to where he usually kept a small dagger, but he'd left it at home today. The headache made him careless. "You have business with me?" The eunuch's eyes scanned the empty street before he produced a slender scroll from his sleeve. Not an official document, this was rice paper, tightly rolled. "A gift," he said, pressing it into Li Chen's hand. His fingers were cold, dry as parchment. Before Li Chen could respond, the eunuch melted back into the shadows between two buildings, disappearing as silently as he'd appeared. Alone in the gathering dark, Li Chen broke the plain wax seal and unrolled the scroll. It was a list of names, written in precise, anonymous calligraphy. Grand Secretary Zhang. Assistant Minister Zhao. 3 other officials he recognized, all in positions overseeing military, finance, or imperial appointments. And at the bottom, fresh ink still gleaming slightly in the torchlight. Li Chen. Next to each name, a single character. Eliminate. The torchlight seemed to dim around him. The evening sounds of the capital, distant voices, a dog barking, the rumble of a cart, faded into a muffled silence. He stared at his own name, the characters staring back like an accusation. They weren't just watching him. They'd written him into their ledger. The morning sun filtered through the paper windows of Li Chen's modest courtyard home, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch like grasping fingers across the wooden floorboards. He stood by the window, the scroll from the elderly eunuch clenched in his hand, its rough paper whispering secrets against his palm. Outside, the capital stirred to life, vendors called their wares, cart wheels rattled over cobblestones, and the distant hum of the Imperial Palace complex promised another day of hidden knives and veiled threats. His wife, Mei Lin, moved through their main room with the quiet efficiency that had kept their household running through years of court service. She arranged teacups on a low table, her movements precise, but Li Chen noticed the slight tremor in her hands that hadn't been there yesterday. When she glanced at him, her eyes held a question she wouldn't voice, not in front of their 2 sons who sat practicing calligraphy at the other end of the room. "Father," said 10-year-old Wei, looking up from his brushwork. "Will you be at the ministry all day again?" Li Chen forced a smile that felt brittle as dried bone. "Perhaps not all day." The knock at their gate came just as Mei Lin poured the tea. 3 sharp raps, then silence. Not the rhythmic pattern of a messenger, nor the deferential tap of a servant. Li Chen's hand went to the scroll in his sleeve, his mind already cataloging possibilities. Assassins wouldn't knock, officials would announce themselves, friends would call his name. Mei Lin froze, the teapot suspended above a cup. Their younger son, 6-year-old Feng, looked up from his paper, ink dripping from his brush to form a dark blossom on the floor. "I'll see to it," Li Chen said, his voice carefully neutral. He crossed the courtyard, the morning dew still clinging to the stones, and opened the gate just enough to see out. 2 men stood there, neither in uniform, neither with the bearing of officials. They wore plain gray robes of decent quality, their faces unremarkable except for the flatness in their eyes that spoke of professional detachment. "Investigator Li," said the taller one, bowing just deep enough to be polite without showing respect. "We bring greetings from Minister Wang of the Ministry of Works." Li Chen knew Minister Wang had no business with him. The Ministry of Works handled construction, irrigation, imperial projects, far removed from investigations or court politics. "What message does the minister send?" he asked, keeping his body blocking the gate opening. The shorter man smiled, revealing teeth stained dark by betel nut. "Only that the minister admires your dedication to your family. He notes your sons are of an age to begin their studies at the Imperial Academy." A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air crept up Li Chen's spine. The Imperial Academy accepted only the sons of high-ranking officials or those with powerful patrons. His position as Imperial Investigator, while respectable, didn't grant such privileges. My sons study well enough here, Li Chen said. Of course, the taller man said. But the minister believes in opportunity for promising youth. He suggests you might wish to discuss their futures, perhaps over tea at his estate tomorrow. Not an invitation. A summons wrapped in silk. Li Chen's mind raced. Minister Wang had ties to the rival noble houses, the ones controlling apothecaries where the blue-tinged toxin variant might be sourced. This wasn't about his son's education. This was a reminder, they knew where he lived, knew his family's routines, knew the vulnerabilities he carried home each night. Convey my gratitude to Minister Wang, Li Chen said, bowing slightly. I will consider his generous offer. The beetle-stained smile widened. Do consider carefully, investigator. The capital grows dangerous these days. Ghosts in the silk, they say. They left without another word, their footsteps fading into the street sounds. Back inside, Mei Lin had cleared the tea things. Her hands were steady now, but her knuckles showed white where she gripped a tray. Who were they? She asked, her voice low. Messengers, Li Chen said, then amended when he saw her expression. From a minister offering patronage for the boys. She understood immediately. Her family had served the court for 3 generations, she knew the language of threats disguised as favors. We should visit my cousin in the Western District, she said, not looking at him. The boys haven't seen their aunt in months. A temporary relocation. Unspoken agreement passed between them. Li Chen nodded. Pack lightly. Only what you can carry without drawing attention. While his family gathered their things, Li Chen retreated to his study. He unrolled the scroll the elderly eunuch had given him, laying it flat on his desk. The list of names stared up at him, 8 officials, their ranks and ministries noted in precise clerical script. His own name appeared 7th, marked with a small character that meant observation rather than elimination. For now. He closed his eyes, letting the world fall away. The forensic memory palace unfolded in his mind, not the grand halls of imperial architecture, but the intimate space he'd built over years of investigation. Here, details didn't fade. Here, evidence waited to be re-examined. He focused on the scroll. Not the words, but the physical object. The paper first, coarse, fibrous, with flecks of darker material embedded in its surface. In his mental reconstruction, he magnified a section, examining the fibers. Not the fine mulberry paper used for imperial decrees, nor the cheap straw paper of common documents. This was middle grade, the kind used for interministerial communications, accounting records, inventory lists. The ink came next. He reconstructed its smell, the faint acridity of pine soot mixed with animal glue. Not the expensive lampblack ink reserved for memorials to the emperor. This was standard ministry issue, the kind that filled thousands of inkstones across the bureaucracy. But there were subtleties. He focused on the brush strokes. The hand was practiced, efficient, a clerk's hand, not a scholar's. The characters showed slight variations in pressure at the end of horizontal strokes, a telltale sign of someone who wrote quickly, under supervision, perhaps copying from another document. Li Chen dug deeper, pushing his ability. The mental strain began as a pressure behind his eyes, familiar and unwelcome. He ignored it, reconstructing the scroll's edges. The left side showed slight fraying, as if it had been torn from a bound ledger. Not cut with a knife, torn. Hurriedly. And there, in the upper right corner, almost invisible, a faint impression, like something had been written on the page above this one in a ledger and left a ghost on this sheet. He magnified it, rotating the mental image, adjusting light and shadow. 4 characters emerged from the impression, Ministry of Rights inventory. The pressure behind his eyes became a pounding. Blood roared in his ears. Li Chen gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. The mental palace wavered, details blurring at the edges. He pushed harder, trying to extract more, a date, a clerk's name, anything. Pain lanced through his skull, sharp and sudden. He gasped, his vision swimming with dark spots. The mental palace collapsed, leaving him dizzy and nauseated, sweat beading on his forehead. When his vision cleared, he looked at the scroll with new understanding. The Ministry of Rights. Responsible for ceremonies, rituals, diplomatic protocols, and the storage and distribution of ceremonial silks. Including, perhaps, the crimson silk that had draped Assistant Minister Zhao's body. Another player. Not just the Minister of War with his silent lotus gardens, not just the rival noble houses with their apothecary toxins. The Ministry of Rights, with access to the very silks appearing at murder scenes. Li Chen took a deep, shuddering breath. The headache settled into a dull throb that promised to linger for hours. He reached for his 4 symbols journal, the coded diagrams that held his real findings. With trembling hands, he added new symbols, a stylized scroll for the Ministry of Rights, linked to the silk symbol he'd created after Zhao's murder. He needed to misdirect them. If they were watching his family, they'd be watching his investigations too. An idea formed, painful in its simplicity. He would leak a false clue, something plausible enough to be believed, dangerous enough to warrant attention, but ultimately leading away from the real threads he followed. He took a fresh sheet of paper and began writing in the same efficient clerical hand he'd seen on the scroll. A report, ostensibly for his superiors, describing new findings about the ghost silk murders. He wrote of discovering traces of mountain ghost fungus at both crime scenes, a rare substance mentioned in folklore about vengeful spirits. He described its supposed properties, its connection to ancient burial rites in the southern provinces. All fiction. But fiction built on enough real details. The southern provinces were indeed known for unusual fungi, and burial rites involved silks, to sound credible to someone checking his work. He would leave this report accidentally visible on his desk at the investigation bureau. Let the spies find it. Let them waste resources chasing mountain ghosts in the south while he traced the real threads here in the capital. Mei Lin appeared at the study door, a small bundle in her arms. "We're ready," she said. Her eyes went to his face, noting the pallor, the tension around his eyes. "You've used it again." "It was necessary." She didn't argue. "The boys think we're visiting Auntie for 3 days. I told them to bring their schoolbooks." "Good." Li Chen stood, the movement sending fresh pain through his head. He folded the false report and tucked it into his sleeve with the real scroll. "We'll leave separately. You and the boys take a hired carriage from the Eastern Market. I'll follow on foot, watching for tails." "You think they'll follow?" "I know they will." Asterisk asterisk asterisk. The relocation unfolded with the tense precision of a military maneuver. Mei Lin and the boys left first, their carriage blending with dozens of others moving through the capital's crowded streets. Li Chen waited a quarter hour, then left through the back gate, slipping into the flow of pedestrians. He moved without seeming to watch, but his eyes catalogued everything: the fruit seller who glanced his way too long, the beggar who shifted position as he passed, the scholar reading a scroll who didn't turn pages. The headache made concentration difficult, turning the bustling streets into a blur of color and noise. At the intersection of Harmony Street and Longevity Avenue, he spotted it. A man in blue robes, 30 paces behind, matching his pace exactly. When Li Chen paused to examine a display of inkstones, the man stopped to tie his shoe. When Li Chen turned down a narrower alley, the man appeared at its mouth moments later. Not an amateur. Professional enough to maintain distance, amateur enough to be visible to someone trained in observation. Li Chen altered his route, leading the tail on a winding path through merchant districts and residential lanes. He needed to confirm this was their only watcher before joining his family at his cousin's house in the Western District. He was crossing a small square near the Temple of Earth when 6-year-old Feng's voice piped up from ahead. "Father! Look at that funny man on the roof." Li Chen's blood went cold. He followed his son's pointing finger. There, on the tiled roof of a 2-story tea house across the square, a figure crouched in the shadow of a decorative ridge. Not watching the street below, watching Li Chen's family, who had just emerged from a carriage 50 paces ahead. The figure was too far to make out features, but the posture was all wrong for a roofer or maintenance worker. This was someone waiting, observing, positioned for a clear line of sight. Mei Lin had frozen, one hand on each boy's shoulder. Her eyes met Li Chen's across the square, wide with understanding. The tail behind him. The watcher on the roof. They weren't just following, they were surrounding. Li Chen's hand went to the dagger at his belt, his mind racing through options, escape routes, ways to get his family to safety. The headache pulsed in time with his heartbeat, a relentless reminder of his vulnerability. On the roof, the figure shifted slightly, sunlight glinting off something metallic in its hand. The scent of rain-soaked earth filled Li Chen's study, a damp reminder of the storm that had passed through the capital the previous night. He sat at his writing desk, the coded 4 symbols journal open before him, its pages filled with diagrams of crime scenes only he could fully decipher. His fingers traced the faint impression on the scroll from the elderly eunuch, Ministry of Rights inventory, as his mind worked through the implications for the 3rd time that morning. 3 factions. The Minister of War with his silent lotus poison. The rival noble houses with their blue-tinged variant. And now the Ministry of Rights, whose scroll had delivered the death list. Each had their own motives, their own methods, but they danced to the same deadly tune of the ghost silk murders. Li Chen's temples throbbed with the beginnings of another headache, a familiar warning that his forbidden ability demanded caution. He needed a wedge. Something to drive between them, to make them turn on each other instead of focusing on him and his family. Rising from his chair, Li Chen moved to the window overlooking the courtyard of his temporary residence. His family was safe at her cousin's house for now, but the memory of Feng pointing out the rooftop watcher still chilled him. The metallic glint in that crouched figure's hand could have been a crossbow, a knife, or something worse. He couldn't afford to wait for their next move. The trap must be forensic, he thought, his mind already beginning the calculations. Not spiritual rumors or political accusations. Something they will believe because it appears to be evidence. He returned to his desk and opened a fresh sheet of paper. His hand moved with deliberate precision as he began sketching, not the coded symbols of his journal, but a map of the capital's western district where the next murder would logically occur if the pattern held. Grand Secretary Zhang in the Eastern Ministerial Quarter. Assistant Minister Zhao at the Temple of Heavenly Peace in the north. The next victim would be someone of similar rank, likely in the western district where many mid-level officials maintained residences. Li Chen closed his eyes, activating his forensic memory palace. The world around him dissolved into darkness, then reformed with perfect clarity. He stood mentally in the Western District's main thoroughfare, the street of harmonious commerce. Every detail reconstructed itself from his memory of visiting the area 3 days prior, the exact placement of merchant stalls, the specific cracks in the paving stones, even the faded characters on a tea shop sign that read, Autumn Breeze Pavilion. In his mental reconstruction, he walked the street, his consciousness noting every potential murder site. An alley behind the silk merchant's warehouse, too obvious. The courtyard of the Assistant Minister of Work's residence, too heavily guarded. The public bathhouse near the western gate, too many witnesses. Then he found it. The Archive of Regional Tributes, a modest government building where mid-level officials from the Ministry of Revenue often worked late reviewing tax records. Its back courtyard was secluded but accessible, with a single guard post that could be bypassed by someone with knowledge of the patrol schedule. Most importantly, it had a storage room for tribute silks, the perfect connection to the ghost silk theme. Li Chen opened his eyes, the real world snapping back into focus. The headache intensified, a sharp pain behind his right eye that made him wince. He reached for the small jar of medicinal paste Mei Lin had prepared for him, a mixture of mint and willow bark that did little for the true cause but soothed the symptoms. For the trap to work, he needed to plant evidence that would point to a 3rd noble house, one not yet implicated. The House of Liang came to mind, a minor but ambitious family with connections to southern apothecaries and a known rivalry with both the Minister of War's faction and the Blue Poison nobles. Perfect. But what evidence? He spent the next hour working through possibilities in his mind, each time dipping into his forensic memory palace to test the scenario. First, a fragment of silk with a distinctive Liang family weave pattern, but that would require obtaining actual Liang silk, which was too risky. Second, a dropped hairpin with the Liang crest, too obvious, too easily dismissed as planted. Then he remembered something from his investigation of Assistant Minister Zhao's body. The blue-tinged toxin had contained trace elements of southern minerals, according to his mental analysis. What if he could create the illusion that the Liang family was using a different variant altogether? One with northern mountain herbs instead of southern minerals. Li Chen's mind raced through the chemical possibilities. He reconstructed the Temple of Heavenly Peace crime scene in his memory palace, focusing on the needle marks on Zhao's neck. In his mental space, he could see the precise arrangement of the 3 punctures, the slight discoloration of the skin, the way the silk had been draped to conceal them. He superimposed a theoretical toxin, one containing wolfsbane and ghost pipe, both northern plants that produced similar exsanguination symptoms but left different metabolic traces. The mental strain made his vision blur. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles white. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. This was deeper reconstruction than he had attempted before, not just remembering a scene, but modifying it theoretically while maintaining forensic plausibility. He pushed through, creating in his mind a perfect false crime scene, the archive of regional tributes back courtyard, a hypothetical victim. He chose a mid-level Ministry of Revenue official named Undersecretary Chen, who actually existed and worked there, the body draped in silk, 3 needle marks containing the northern herb variant, and, crucially, a single dropped glove embroidered with the Liang family's phoenix motif in threads that contained traces of the same northern herbs. Every detail had to withstand scrutiny. The placement of the glove, not too close to the body, not too far. The way it would have fallen from a struggling victim. The type of knot used to secure the silk drape, a sailor's knot, which the Liang family's maritime traders would know. The specific pressure points used, different from both previous murders, suggesting a third practitioner. Li Chen spent the entire morning in this mental construction, refining each element. When he finally emerged from the concentration, the sun had moved to its zenith, and his headache had become a pounding agony that made thinking difficult. He stumbled to his bed, collapsing onto the thin mattress. The world spun around him, and for a terrifying moment, he feared he might lose consciousness entirely. He lay there for what felt like hours, breathing slowly, focusing on the pattern of cracks in the ceiling beams. This was the price of the memory palace. Every extended use drained him physically, leaving him vulnerable. He remembered the warning from the elderly physician who had discovered his ability when he was a boy: the mind was not meant to hold such perfect reconstructions. Each one chips away at your vitality. When he could move again, it was late afternoon. He forced himself to eat some cold rice and pickled vegetables, though his stomach rebelled at the thought. The plan was complete in his mind. Now he had to execute it. The actual planting would be the dangerous part. He couldn't go himself. If he was seen near the archive, the trap would be obvious. He needed a proxy, someone who could be persuaded or bribed to leave the evidence without knowing its true purpose. Li Chen thought of the network of informants he had cultivated over his years as an investigator. Most were too closely watched now. But there was old Kong, the night watchman at the archive who had once tipped him off about a corruption case in exchange for keeping his son out of trouble. Kong owed him, and more importantly, Kong was greedy. That evening, under cover of darkness, Li Chen made his way to the western district using back alleys and covered walkways. He kept his hood up, his movements deliberately casual but his senses alert for followers. Twice he doubled back, once he cut through a perfumer's shop whose owner knew him, emerging from a different door. The rooftop watcher from yesterday was nowhere to be seen, but that didn't mean he wasn't there. He found old Kong at his usual post near the archive's side gate, huddled under a small awning to avoid the drizzle that had begun to fall. The watchman's eyes widened when he recognized Li Chen approaching from the shadows. "Investigator Li," Kong whispered, glancing nervously up and down the street. "You shouldn't be here. There's been talk." "I need a service," Li Chen said quietly, pressing a small pouch of silver into Kang's hand. "Nothing dangerous. Just leave this in the back courtyard tomorrow evening." He produced a wrapped package containing the fabricated evidence, a glove he had purchased from a second-hand market and carefully embroidered with a phoenix pattern using threads he had soaked in a solution containing minute amounts of wolfsbane and ghost pipe, purchased separately from different herbalists to avoid suspicion. Along with it was a small vial of the same herb mixture, and a scrap of silk with a sailor's knot tied in it. "Place it near the tribute storage door," Li Chen instructed. "Not hidden, but not in plain sight. As if it fell from someone's pocket during a struggle." Kang's hands trembled as he took the package. "What is this, investigator?" "A piece of a puzzle," Li Chen said. "One that will keep both of us safer if placed correctly. You remember what I did for your son?" The watchman nodded, his face pale in the dim light. "I remember." "Then trust me now. Place it tomorrow at the second watch. No earlier, no later. And if anyone asks, you saw nothing." Li Chen slipped back into the shadows, leaving Kong staring at the package in his hands. The headache was returning, a dull throb at the base of his skull. He needed to rest, to recover from the day's mental exertion. For the next 2 days, Li Chen remained in his temporary residence, claiming illness to his few remaining colleagues who checked on him. The truth was he could barely rise from his bed. The extended use of the forensic memory palace had left him with a fatigue so deep it felt like his bones were made of lead. He slept fitfully, his dreams filled with reconstructed crime scenes that twisted into impossible configurations. On the third day, as he was finally able to sit up and take some broth, the rumors began to reach him. A servant girl bringing his meal whispered that there was talk in the markets about the Liang family being involved in the ghost silk murders. A messenger from the Ministry of Justice, one of the few still willing to communicate with him, mentioned offhand that the Minister of War had suddenly called for increased scrutiny of southern trade routes, a direct challenge to the Liang family's interests. By the fourth day, the infighting had become public. A Liang family cousin was arrested on trumped-up smuggling charges. In retaliation, someone leaked documents suggesting the Minister of War's faction had been skimming military funds. The Blue Poison nobles, sensing weakness, began making moves to seize control of several key apothecaries previously under Liang influence. Li Chen's trap had worked better than he had hoped. The conspirators were turning on each other, each believing another faction had betrayed them or was making a power grab. The attention shifted away from him, away from his family. He allowed himself a small, weary smile as he sat at his desk on the fifth day, finally strong enough to work again. He opened his Four Symbols journal and began updating it with careful notes about the trap's execution, using the coded diagrams to record what he had planted where and why. That was when the knock came at his door. Not the tentative tap of a servant, but the firm, authoritative rap of someone used to being obeyed. Li Chen carefully closed his journal and slid it into its hiding place behind a loose floorboard before answering. Standing in the corridor was Undersecretary Wen, a man he had worked with on 3 previous cases. Wen's face was pale, his official robes slightly disheveled as if he had come in haste. Li Chen, Wen said without preamble, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. We don't have much time. What's happened? Wen glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on the desk where the journal had been moments before. The Minister of War has ordered an audit. All investigators, all their records, everything. He claims it's to root out corruption, but we both know what he's really looking for. Li Chen felt a cold knot form in his stomach. When? Tomorrow morning. They'll start with the senior investigators and work down. You're on the list for the afternoon session. Wen leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. He knows you have evidence, Li Chen. Not what it is or where, but he knows. If they find your notes. He didn't need to finish the sentence. If the Minister of War discovered the coded journal with its diagrams linking him to the Silent Lotus poison, Li Chen's family would be dead within hours, and he would follow shortly after in some unfortunate accident. Thank you for the warning, Li Chen said, his mind already racing through possibilities. He had one night to secure his evidence or make it disappear entirely. Wen nodded, clasping his shoulder briefly. Be careful, old friend. These people play for keeps. After Wen left, Li Chen stood in the center of the room, the weight of the situation settling over him. The trap had bought him time, but now the Minister of War was making his move directly. The audit would turn his office inside out, and while the journal was hidden here at his residence, they would eventually search here too if they found nothing at his official workplace. He had to decide, destroy the evidence that could bring down the conspiracy, or find a way to hide it where even the Minister of War's agents couldn't find it. Either choice carried mortal risk. Outside, the rain began to fall again, tapping against the window like impatient fingers. Somewhere in the city, 3 factions were at each other's throats because of evidence he had planted. And somewhere else, the Minister of War was preparing to strip him of the very tools he needed to survive. Li Chen moved to the window, watching the droplets trace paths down the glass. In their erratic courses, he saw the tangled web of the conspiracy, the threads of poison and silk and politics that he had to navigate with nothing but his mind and his memory. The headache threatened to return, but he pushed it down. There would be time for pain later. For now, he had an audit to prepare for, and evidence to protect from the most powerful man in the empire after the emperor himself. The archive of regional tributes stood silent in the pre-dawn gloom, its wooden beams creaking with the weight of centuries. Li Chen moved through the narrow aisles between towering shelves, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust that coated the floorboards. Moonlight filtered through the high, latticed windows, casting long shadows that seemed to shift with every breath he took. He had returned under cover of darkness, hours before the imperial bureaucracy would stir to life. The warning from Undersecretary Wen echoed in his mind, the Minister of War's audit would begin today, and every scrap of evidence in his possession was now a potential death warrant. His coded 4 symbols journal remained safely hidden in the false bottom of his travel chest, but he needed something more, something that could not be dismissed as the ravings of a desperate investigator. His fingers traced the spines of ledgers documenting tribute shipments from distant provinces, bolts of silk from Jiangnan, medicinal herbs from Sichuan, rare minerals from the northern mountains. Each volume told a story of imperial power and regional loyalty, but Li Chen searched for a different narrative, one written in poison and blood. It was in the third aisle from the eastern wall that he found it. The ledger looked no different from the others, bound in faded blue cloth, its edges worn smooth by time. But as he pulled it from the shelf, a faint scent of camphor and something sharper, bitter almond, wafted from its pages. His pulse quickened. He carried the volume to a reading desk near one of the windows, where the first gray light of dawn was beginning to paint the sky. Opening the cover revealed no title page, only columns of characters written in a precise, bureaucratic hand. The entries began 5 years earlier, documenting what appeared to be routine shipments of medicinal supplies to various noble households. But as Li Chen's eyes scanned down the pages, patterns emerged. Shipments of white lotus root to the Minister of War's estate every 3rd month. Deliveries of blue gentian powder to 3 different noble houses aligned with the apothecary guilds. Consignments of northern wolf's bane to the house of Liang, the very family he had framed with his forensic trap. His breath caught. These were not medicinal herbs. They were code names for the toxins used in the ghost silk murders. Li Chen closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe slowly. The air in the archive felt suddenly thick, pressing against his skin. He opened his eyes again and began turning pages more deliberately, his mind already calculating. The ledger contained over 200 pages of entries, each line a potential thread in the conspiracy's web. He needed to memorize it all. He placed his palms flat on the desk, the cool wood steadying him. Then he activated the forensic memory palace. The world around him dissolved into a shimmering haze. The scent of dust and old paper faded, replaced by the crisp clarity of mental reconstruction. In his mind's eye, the ledger floated before him, its pages turning of their own accord. Every character, every stroke of ink, every faint water stain at the corner of page 47, all of it burned itself into his consciousness with perfect, unforgiving detail. He saw the patterns not just as isolated entries but as a living network. The Silent Lotus shipments increased in frequency 6 months before Grand Secretary Zhang's murder. The blue-tinged variant appeared in records only after Assistant Minister Zhao's death, suggesting the rival nobles had developed their own formula in response. The northern herbs linked to the Liang family showed irregular deliveries, hinting at experimental batches. But the most damning evidence lay in the distribution records. Each toxin shipment coincided with political events, promotions of officials who later died, transfers of military commanders, changes in tax collection policies. The ledger wasn't just a record of poison, it was a map of the conspiracy's growth, showing how the assassinations had been systematically planned to reshape the court's power structure. Li Chen's head began to throb. A sharp pain lanced through his temples, as if someone were driving needles behind his eyes. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the archive's chill. The mental exertion required to maintain such perfect recall was immense, far beyond what he had attempted before. Reconstructing a crime scene took minutes, memorizing an entire ledger demanded hours of concentrated focus compressed into a single, agonizing moment. He felt his body trembling, muscles straining against the invisible weight of the information flooding his mind. The characters seemed to swim before his closed eyes, their meanings blurring into a chaotic stream of data. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to maintain the connection. He couldn't afford to lose a single detail. Page after page imprinted itself on his memory. He memorized the handwriting variations that suggested multiple scribes had contributed over the years. He noted the occasional smudges where ink had been hastily blotted, as if entries had been made in secret or under pressure. He catalogued the faint impressions left by previous pages, ghost characters that hinted at earlier versions of the ledger, perhaps more explicit records that had been destroyed. The pain intensified. It spread from his temples down his neck, coiling around his spine like a serpent of fire. His breathing grew ragged, each inhalation a struggle against the pressure building inside his skull. Dark spots danced at the edges of his vision, threatening to swallow the reconstructed pages whole. Just as he reached the final entry, a delivery of white lotus root scheduled for next week, the connection snapped. Li Chen gasped, his eyes flying open. The real world rushed back in a disorienting wave. The archive shelves tilted dangerously, and he had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. Nausea churned in his stomach, bitter and acidic. His entire body felt hollowed out, drained of vitality as if he had aged 10 years in those few minutes. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking uncontrollably, the tremors running up through his arms to his shoulders. The ledger still lay open before him, its pages now holding no secrets. He knew every character, every stain, every hidden meaning. But the knowledge had come at a terrible cost. Pushing himself upright, Li Chen fumbled for the writing materials he had brought, a stack of thin rice paper, a brush, and a small inkstone. His movements were clumsy, uncoordinated. He spilled water as he ground the ink, the black liquid pooling on the desk like a dark omen. He had to copy the key pages. The ledger itself was too dangerous to remove, its absence would be noticed immediately, especially with the audit team arriving. But he could extract the most damning entries, the shipments to the Minister of War's estate, the distribution patterns that matched the murder timeline, the coded names that linked multiple noble houses to the conspiracy. His brush strokes were uneven at first, the characters wavering as his hand continued to shake. He forced himself to slow down, to focus on each stroke despite the pounding in his head. The act of copying became a meditation, a way to anchor himself in the physical world as his body screamed for rest. He selected 23 pages in total, choosing entries that formed an undeniable chain of evidence. As he worked, his mind automatically cross-referenced the information with what he already knew from his investigations. The White Lotus root shipments matched the Silent Lotus toxin found in Grand Secretary Zhang's body. The blue gentian powder correlated with the variant used on Assistant Minister Zhao. The northern herbs aligned with the wolfsbane and ghost pipe traces he had planted in his forensic trap. When the last character was copied, Li Chen carefully blotted the pages and set them aside to dry. The originals he returned to the ledger, making sure to replace the volume exactly as he had found it on the shelf. His movements were slow, deliberate, each action requiring immense effort as fatigue settled into his bones like lead. He rolled the copied pages into a tight cylinder and secured them with a plain silk cord. For a moment, he considered where to hide them. His office was out of the question, it would be searched during the audit. His home was compromised, with watchers still surrounding his family's temporary residence. The archive itself held too many risks. His eyes fell on the reading desk. One of the legs had a hairline crack running up its side, barely visible in the dim light. Using the tip of his dagger, he carefully widened the crack just enough to slip the rolled pages inside. The hollow space within the leg was small but deep, a perfect hiding place that would go unnoticed unless someone dismantled the furniture entirely. As he pressed the last edge of the silk cord into the wood, he heard it. Footsteps. They echoed from the far end of the archive, sharp and purposeful against the stone floor. Not the shuffling gait of an elderly archivist or the hurried steps of a junior clerk. These were the measured strides of officials on official business, their leather-soled boots clicking in unison. Li Chen froze, his hand still pressed against the desk leg. The footsteps grew louder, moving down the central aisle toward his location. Too early, the audit team wasn't supposed to arrive until midday, and dawn had only just broken. Someone had moved up the schedule, or perhaps this was a separate inspection altogether. He forced himself to move, his body protesting every motion. He returned the inkstone and brush to his satchel, wiped the spilled ink from the desk with his sleeve, and stepped away from the reading area. His mind raced through possibilities. Had they been watching him? Did they know about the ledger? Or was this simply bad timing, the cruel coincidence of a conspiracy tightening its grip? The footsteps rounded the corner of the aisle. Li Chen straightened his robes, willing his hands to stop trembling. He could see shadows lengthening on the floor ahead, cast by lantern light. Multiple figures, moving with the confidence of men who held authority. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and impending confrontation. The hidden pages felt like a burning brand against his consciousness, their secrets screaming to be heard. But for now, they would remain silent, buried in wood and shadow as the footsteps drew nearer, each step a drumbeat counting down to discovery. The morning sun had barely begun to paint the eastern sky when Li Chen heard the heavy footsteps echoing down the corridor of the Ministry of Justice. He sat at his modest desk, the coded 4 symbols journal hidden beneath a stack of routine investigation reports. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the lingering exhaustion that clung to his bones like damp silk. The previous day's mental exertion in the archive had left him hollowed out, his thoughts moving through thick syrup. 3 men entered without knocking. They wore the dark blue robes of the Minister of War's personal guard, their faces carved from stone. The leader was a man with a scar that bisected his left eyebrow, giving him a perpetual look of mild surprise that didn't reach his cold eyes. Imperial Investigator Li Chen, the scarred man announced, his voice flat. By order of the Minister of War, we are conducting an audit of all investigative records pertaining to the Ghost Silk murders. You will surrender all documents, notes, and personal journals. Li Chen rose slowly, his joints protesting. He kept his expression carefully neutral, the practiced mask of a minor official facing his superiors. Of course. My work has been thoroughly documented in the official case files, which are already with the archives. We are not interested in what you filed officially, another guard said, his eyes already scanning the small office. We want everything. Personal notes. Draft reports. Correspondence. As they began moving toward his desk, Li Chen felt the familiar pressure building behind his eyes. He closed them for a heartbeat, and the forensic memory palace unfolded in his mind. The office as it should be. He reconstructed every detail, the exact placement of each scroll on his desk, the angle of the inkstone, the slight tear in the corner of the rug where he'd caught his foot last week. Then he layered in what needed to be there for the auditors to see, the false report about mountain ghost fungus he'd prepared days earlier, prominently displayed. The routine correspondence with Undersecretary went about administrative matters. The carefully curated selection of case notes that contained nothing but observations anyone might have made. Asterisk and the journal. The journal must remain hidden, asterisk. He visualized the stack of reports on his desk, the third one from the top, a dull treatise on grain storage regulations from 3 years prior. Beneath it, the 4 symbols journal with its damning patterns and connections. He saw in perfect detail how the edges aligned, how the weight distribution would feel if someone lifted the stack. You may examine everything, Li Chen said, stepping aside. His voice sounded calm, but his heart hammered against his ribs. I have nothing to hide from the minister's audit. The scarred guard moved to the desk and began methodically going through the papers. Li Chen watched, his mind racing through possibilities. If they lifted the entire stack, the journal might be revealed. If they shuffled through individually. What is this? The guard held up the false report about mountain ghost fungus. Li Chen felt a flicker of relief. Asterisk good. Take the bait, asterisk preliminary notes on possible natural explanations for the deaths, he said, keeping his tone conversational. There are records from the southern provinces of fungi that can cause paralysis and bleeding from minor punctures. I thought it worth investigating, though the evidence remains inconclusive. The guard studied the document, his eyes narrowing. You believe spirits are not involved? I believe, Li Chen said carefully, that as an Imperial investigator, I must consider all possibilities before reaching conclusions. The court whispers of vengeful ghosts, but my duty is to examine physical evidence. He could see the man weighing this. The forensic memory palace showed him the guard's micro-expressions, the slight tightening around the mouth, the way his eyes darted to his companions. They were looking for something specific. Not general incompetence, but particular evidence. Asterisk they know about the ledger. Or suspect it, asterisk. The realization chilled him even as he maintained his calm exterior. The mental reconstruction continued, showing him every movement the guards made, every document they touched. He rehearsed responses in his mind, testing each one for plausibility, for the right balance of cooperation and professional pride. These notes are remarkably sparse for such high-profile cases, the second guard commented, flipping through Li Chen's official case files. The victims were senior officials, Li Chen replied, the words coming smoothly from his rehearsed mental script. I have been cautious in recording sensitive observations until conclusions can be verified. Would the minister prefer I spread unsubstantiated rumors through careless documentation? A dangerous gambit, questioning the minister's preferences. But the forensic memory palace showed him the guard's hesitation, the man wasn't authorized to answer such questions. For 2 hours they searched. They opened every drawer, felt along the edges of shelves for hidden compartments, even examined the legs of his desk. Li Chen stood quietly, his mind working constantly. Each time a guard approached something dangerous, the stack hiding his journal, the hollow in the wall where he kept emergency supplies, he would redirect with a question or comment. "That inkstone was a gift from my former mentor," he said when one guard picked it up, examining its underside. "He served the previous emperor. I'm told the Minister of War respected him greatly." The guard set it down carefully. The mental exertion was taking its toll. Sweat beaded on Li Chen's forehead despite the morning chill. The headache that had been lurking since his archive work returned with vicious intensity, a band of iron tightening around his skull. He focused on breathing evenly, on keeping his hands from trembling. Finally, the scarred guard turned to him. "Your records appear to be in order, investigator." The words should have brought relief, but Li Chen heard the unspoken warning in them. "Appear to be." However, the guard continued, "The minister wishes to remind all investigators that the Ghost Silk murders have caused considerable unrest in the court. He expects discretion and, above all, loyalty to the throne." "My loyalty has never been in question," Li Chen said, bowing slightly. The guard's eyes held his for a moment too long. "See that it remains so. The minister takes a personal interest in this investigation. He will be disappointed if it leads to unnecessary complications." They left as abruptly as they had come, their footsteps fading down the corridor. Li Chen waited until the sound disappeared completely before allowing himself to sink into his chair. His hands shook openly now, the adrenaline draining away to leave only exhaustion. He reached for the stack of reports, his fingers finding the hidden journal. Still safe. For now. But the warning had been clear. The Minister of War wasn't just suspicious, he was actively hunting. The audit wasn't routine bureaucracy, it was a predator testing the fences. Li Chen spent the remainder of the day in a haze of fatigue. Every sound in the corridor made him tense. Every shadow seemed to hold watching eyes. He attempted to work, to review the patterns he'd memorized from the hidden ledger, but his thoughts kept scattering like dropped coins. The forensic memory palace, usually so sharp and clear, felt blurred at the edges, as if viewed through poorly made glass. By evening, he could barely keep his eyes open. The lack of sleep from the previous night combined with today's stress had left him hollowed out. He decided to leave early, hoping a night's rest might restore some clarity. The walk home through the gathering dusk felt longer than usual. The streets of the capital were still busy with evening commerce, vendors packing up their stalls, laborers heading home, the occasional litter carrying some noble to evening engagements. Li Chen moved through them like a ghost himself, seeing everything but registering nothing. He reached the small house he'd been using since relocating his family. It was a modest place in a quarter of minor officials and merchants, chosen precisely because it drew no attention. As he approached the door, something on the step caught his eye. At first he thought it was a fallen leaf, dark against the stone. Then he saw the shape. A sparrow. Small and brown, perfectly ordinary except for the way it lay, wings slightly spread, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Dead. Li Chen froze, his exhaustion vanishing in a cold rush. He knelt slowly, examining the bird without touching it. No visible wounds. No signs of struggle. Just a dead sparrow placed carefully in the center of his doorstep. In the Dynasty's traditions, a dead bird on the threshold wasn't merely an omen. It was a message. A specific, deliberate threat. Sparrows were creatures of the common people, small, numerous, easily overlooked until they were gone. A warning that someone could be eliminated as easily and with as little consequence as this bird. Li Chen's eyes scanned the street. The vendor across the way was closing his shutters. An old woman carried water from the well. A child chased a hoop down the lane. Normal evening scenes. But somewhere in the gathering shadows, someone had been here. Someone had left this message. He picked up the sparrow carefully, using a corner of his robe to avoid touching it directly. Its body was still slightly warm. Recent, then. Very recent. As he straightened, he noticed something else, a single, deliberate footprint in the dust beside the step. Too clean to be accidental. Pointing toward his door. They weren't just watching anymore. They were telling him they could reach him anytime. At his office. At his home. The audit hadn't been the main event, it had been the distraction while they positioned this threat. Li Chen unlocked his door and stepped inside, closing it quietly behind him. He stood in the dark room, the dead sparrow cradled in cloth in his hand. The weight of it felt enormous, far beyond its tiny form. Outside, dusk deepened into night. Somewhere in the capital, the conspirators were moving. And they had just reminded him how small he was in their game. How easily crushed. The morning mist clung to the palace corridors like damp silk, muffling footsteps and turning lantern light into hazy halos. Li Chen stood before the Deputy Minister of Personnel, his body still aching from the exhaustion of the audit and the dead sparrow's silent threat. The official's face was pale, his fingers tapping nervously on a scroll. "Investigator Li," the Deputy Minister said, voice low. "A minor official from the Ministry of Works, Clerk Shen, has disappeared. He was scheduled to give testimony about the night Assistant Minister Zhao was murdered at the Temple of Heavenly Peace. He claimed to have seen something near the temple gates that evening." Li Chen's mind immediately began calculating. Assistant Minister Zhao, the second ghost silk murder victim. If Clerk Shen had witnessed something, he was either a threat to the conspirators or knew something that could unravel their careful staging. When was he last seen? Li Chen asked, keeping his voice neutral. 2 nights ago. At his quarters in the Eastern Clerk's compound. His bed was unslept in, his personal effects untouched except for a half-drunk cup of tea gone cold. The Deputy Minister handed over a thin dossier. "The Minister of War has taken personal interest in this disappearance. He wants the witness found before rumors spread about improper handling of the investigation." Li Chen understood the unspoken threat. The Minister of War was testing him. Either Li Chen would find the witness and potentially uncover something dangerous, or he would fail and give the minister grounds to question his competence. Both paths led to danger. He took the dossier, his fingers brushing against the coarse paper. "I'll begin immediately." The Eastern Clerk's compound was a modest collection of small rooms arranged around a central courtyard, far from the opulent halls of the main palace. The air smelled of ink, cheap lamp oil, and the faint mustiness of old paper. Clerk Shen's room was on the second floor, overlooking a narrow alley where laundry hung between buildings like faded banners. 2 junior investigators from the Ministry of Justice stood guard outside, their faces tense. They stepped aside as Li Chen approached, one of them murmuring, "No one's touched anything since yesterday, investigator." Li Chen nodded and pushed the door open. The room was small, barely 10 paces square. A narrow bed against one wall, its thin mattress neatly made. A writing desk beneath the single window, with brushes arranged precisely in their holder. A small table held a ceramic teapot and a single cup, the tea inside forming a scummy film on the surface. The room spoke of a meticulous man living a modest, ordered life. Li Chen closed his eyes and took a deep breath, preparing to activate his forensic memory palace. The exhaustion from the past days still clung to him, a deep weariness in his bones, a slight tremor in his hands. Using the cheat now would cost him, but he had no choice. He opened his eyes and began his examination, committing every detail to memory. The bed first. He noted the precise folds of the blanket, the pillow placed exactly at the head. No signs of struggle. The writing desk, papers neatly stacked, ink stone dry. He opened the single drawer and found personal letters from a sister in the provinces, a small pouch containing a few copper coins, and a jade hairpin wrapped in silk. Then the table with the tea. Li Chen leaned close, studying the cup. The tea had been poured but only half drunk. No lip marks on the rim, it had been sipped from, not gulped. The teapot was cold, the leaves inside still expanded from steeping. He moved to the window. The latch was unsecured. Outside, the alley below showed nothing unusual, just damp cobblestones and the hanging laundry. Li Chen returned to the center of the room and closed his eyes again. This was the moment. He focused his mind, pushing through the fatigue that threatened to cloud his thoughts. The forensic memory palace activated. The room reconstructed itself in his mind with perfect clarity. Not just as it was now, but as it had been. He could see the subtle disturbances in the heir's memory, the faint traces left by movement and intention. In his mental reconstruction, he saw Clerk Shen entering the room 2 nights ago. The man was in his 40s, slight of build, with ink-stained fingers. He lit the oil lamp on the desk. Li Chen's mind noted the precise level of oil in the lamp now versus what it should have been. Shen poured himself tea, sat at the table, sipped slowly. He was nervous, his fingers tapped the tabletop in an irregular rhythm. Then the door opened. Not forced, opened. Someone Shen knew, or at least didn't fear immediately. Li Chen's mental reconstruction showed the door swinging inward without resistance, no splintering of wood, no torn hinges. Two figures entered. Not guards, their movements were too fluid, too practiced at stealth. They wore dark clothing, faces obscured. Clerk Shen stood up, his posture showing recognition but then confusion, then fear. There was a struggle, but a quiet one. One figure grabbed Shen from behind while the other pressed something to his face, a cloth. Shen struggled briefly, his feet scraping against the floorboards. Li Chen's mind focused on those scrapes, reconstructing their pattern. Then Shen went limp. The figures carried him out. Before they left, one of them returned to the table and carefully arranged the teacup, making it look as though Shen had simply left mid-drink. They checked the room, ensuring nothing was obviously disturbed. Li Chen's mind continued probing, searching for details his eyes might have missed. He focused on the floor where Shen's feet had scraped. There, minute traces of something. Dust disturbed in a particular pattern. And something else, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer on the floorboards near the door. He opened his eyes, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The mental exertion had taken its toll, a sharp headache bloomed behind his eyes, and a wave of dizziness made him steady himself against the wall. He could feel his vitality draining, the cost of using the cheat while already exhausted. But he had seen what he needed. He knelt by the door, examining the floorboards where his reconstruction had shown the shimmer. Using a small scraping tool from his belt pouch, he collected a minute sample of whatever substance had been there. He brought it close to his nose, inhaling carefully. The scent was faint but unmistakable, bitter almonds mixed with something floral. The same poison variant used in Assistant Minister Zhao's murder. The blue poison variant from the rival noble house. So the conspirators were cleaning up loose ends. And they were using their signature toxins even for kidnappings, confident that the supernatural rumors would cover their tracks. Li Chen stood, his legs unsteady. He needed to report this, but he couldn't reveal what he'd truly discovered. The Minister of War's audit had shown him how closely he was being watched. Any deviation from the official narrative would put his family at risk. He left the room and addressed the junior investigators waiting outside. Clerk Shen appears to have fled in the night. Signs suggest he left in haste, tea unfinished, window unlatched. Given his scheduled testimony about the temple murder, it's likely fear of vengeful spirits drove him to abandon his post. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He was fabricating the spiritual explanation even as he stood in the room where a man had been kidnapped, possibly already dead. But it was necessary. The public story had to maintain the ghost narrative. One of the investigators frowned. "Should we search for him, investigator?" "Post notices at the city gates," Li Chen said, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the pounding in his head. "But I suspect he's already left the capital." A man frightened by what he thinks he saw. He let the implication hang in the air. They nodded, accepting the explanation. In a dynasty where supernatural beliefs ran deep, a clerk fleeing ghostly vengeance was more plausible than political kidnapping. Li Chen returned to his office, the headache now a persistent throb. He needed rest, but there was no time. He had to record his actual findings in the Four Symbols journal, using the coded system only he understood. The sample of poison residue went into a hidden compartment in his desk, alongside the other evidence he was collecting. As he worked, his mind kept returning to the reconstruction. The efficiency of the kidnapping. The use of the specific poison variant. This wasn't panic, it was a calculated move by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And if they were kidnapping potential witnesses, they were getting nervous. His forensic trap with the House of Liang had stirred the hornet's nest more than he'd anticipated. The day passed in a blur of official reports and fabricated spiritual explanations. Li Chen forced himself to eat, though food had no taste. He drank bitter tea to stay alert, but his body screamed for proper rest. The combined exhaustion from the archive investigation, the audit, and now this reconstruction was taking its toll. As evening fell and he prepared to leave for home, wary now of what he might find on his doorstep, a palace messenger arrived at his office. The messenger was young, dressed in plain servant's clothing, his face carefully neutral. He handed Li Chen a small scroll case without speaking, then bowed and departed. Li Chen waited until he was alone before opening the case. Inside was a single strip of bamboo, the characters carved in a rough, hurried hand. Meet at the abandoned mill at dawn if you want the witness alive. No signature. No further details. Just the time, the place, and the implication that Clerk Shen might still be living. Li Chen stared at the message, his mind already calculating. The abandoned mill was outside the city walls, in an area rarely patrolled. A perfect place for an ambush. Or an exchange. Or a murder made to look like another victim of the ghosts. He thought of Mei Lin and Feng, of the dead sparrow on his doorstep, of the rooftop watcher his son had spotted. If he went to the mill, he walked into a trap. If he didn't go, a man might die, a man whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, if Clerk Shen was alive, he might have seen something crucial. Something that could break the case open without implicating the Minister of War directly. Something Li Chen could use. The headache pulsed behind his eyes as he weighed the decision. Every choice carried risk. Every move was watched. He carefully placed the bamboo strip in a hidden pocket, then extinguished the oil lamp in his office. In the darkness, he could still see the mental reconstruction of Clerk Shen's kidnapping, the quiet struggle, the poisoned cloth, the careful staging afterward. Dawn was only hours away. And the abandoned mill waited. Dawn painted the eastern sky in bruised purples and sickly yellows as Li Chen approached the abandoned mill. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp rot and old grain dust. He had come alone, as the cryptic message demanded, his official robes exchanged for simple dark traveling clothes that offered little protection but less visibility. Every muscle in his body ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, the cumulative toll of too many visits to his forensic memory palace while already drained. His mind felt like overstretched parchment, thin and ready to tear. The mill stood at the edge of the capital's western district, where the city's ordered streets gave way to neglected workshops and overgrown lots. Its water wheel hung motionless, half-collapsed into the sluggish creek that fed it. The wooden structure leaned precariously, its timbers gray with age and weather. Li Chen paused 50 paces away, his eyes scanning. No movement. No sound but the distant cry of a crow and the whisper of the morning breeze through broken shutters. He forced his breathing steady. This was a trap. It had to be. Yet Clerk Shen's life, and whatever the minor official had witnessed about Assistant Minister Zhao's murder, might depend on this meeting. Li Chen's hand drifted to the small dagger concealed in his sleeve, its weight a cold comfort. He had brought no other weapons. Bringing guards would have guaranteed Shen's death, and likely his own family's retaliation. The dead sparrow on his doorstep 2 nights prior had made that calculus brutally clear. Step by cautious step, he closed the distance. The mill's main door hung ajar, one hinge rusted through. Darkness pooled within. Li Chen paused at the threshold, letting his eyes adjust. The interior was a cavern of shadows, thick with cobwebs and the ghostly shapes of abandoned machinery. A large grinding stone dominated the center of the room, its surface dusted with what might have been flour decades ago. To the left, a rickety staircase led to a partial upper loft. Then he saw them. Clerk Shen lay bound and gagged near the far wall, his Ministry of Works robes torn and dirty. The man's eyes were wide with terror, his chest heaving against the ropes. And around him, 3 figures stood in deliberate stillness. They wore dark, close-fitting clothes without insignia, their faces obscured by cloth masks. Each held a weapon, 2 with narrow-bladed jian swords, 1 with a hooked rope dart coiled in his hand. They had positioned themselves strategically, 1 by the main door Li Chen had just entered, 1 near the staircase, 1 beside Shen. Covering all exits. Li Chen did not move further inside. He stood just within the doorway, his back to the dim light of dawn. I came as requested, he said, his voice calm despite the hammering of his heart. Release the witness. The assassin by the staircase, taller than the others, with a cold stillness to his posture, spoke first. His voice was muffled by the mask but clear enough. You have something we want, investigator. The evidence you've gathered. The ledger from the archive. Hand it over, and the clerk walks out with you. Li Chen's mind raced. They knew about the ledger. Of course they did, the Minister of War's audit had been a warning shot. But they didn't know he had copied pages, didn't know where he'd hidden them. They were fishing. Testing his defenses. He needed time. Needed to understand the space, the threats. Every instinct screamed to activate his forensic memory palace, to reconstruct this scene, to find weaknesses. But the cost, he could feel the exhaustion like a weight on his soul. Using the cheat now might leave him too drained to react, to fight or flee. Yet without it, he was blind. He made the choice. Closing his eyes for the briefest moment, Li Chen reached inward. The world around him seemed to freeze, then reform in perfect, crystalline detail within his mind's eye. The forensic memory palace unfolded, not as a physical place, but as a layered reconstruction of reality. He saw the mill not as it appeared, but as it was, every splinter on the floorboards, every crack in the wall, the exact placement of each assassin, the tension in their stances, the glint of weak light on their blades. But the mental exertion was immediate and brutal. A sharp pain lanced through his temples, and his vision swam when he opened his eyes. His breath came shorter. The cheat was burning through what little stamina he had left, like a lamp consuming its last drops of oil. He had minutes, perhaps less, before collapse. Within the memory palace, he analyzed. The assassin by the door, his footing was on a loose floorboard that creaked under slight pressure. The one by the staircase, the third step up was rotten, weight on it would likely break through. The one with the rope dart near Shen, his position put him directly under a heavy, rusted pulley system suspended from the ceiling beams. The ropes holding it were frayed, weakened by age. Escape routes, the main door was blocked, but a small, high window on the east wall was unguarded, if he could reach it. The creek outside was shallow but might provide cover if he could get Shen moving. Li Chen let the memory palace fade, the mental image dissolving into the painful throb behind his eyes. He swayed slightly, catching himself on the doorframe. The tall assassin noticed. "You look unwell, investigator." The strain of keeping secrets. The strain of dealing with men who hide their faces, Li Chen retorted, forcing strength into his voice. He needed to negotiate, not fight. A direct confrontation would end with him dead and Shen silenced. "I don't have the ledger with me. It's hidden. But I can offer you something else." The assassins exchanged glances. The one by Shen tightened his grip on the rope dart. "What?" "Proof that the rival noble house is preparing to move against your master," Li Chen said, the lie forming smoothly on his tongue. He pulled a small, sealed scroll from his inner pocket, a decoy he prepared after the dead sparrow, containing fabricated notes about mountain ghost fungus and false accusations against the rival faction. This details their toxin shipments from the southern provinces. It implicates them directly in the ghost silk murders. Take it to your minister. It's more valuable to him than some clerk's testimony. He held the scroll out. The tall assassin gestured, and the one by the door stepped forward to take it, his movements cautious. Li Chen noted the slight shift in their attention. The offer of tangible evidence, even false, was a distraction they hadn't expected. "How do we know this is real?" the tall assassin demanded. "You don't," Li Chen said. "But if it's false, you lose nothing. If it's real, you gain leverage. The clerk is a minor witness. This scroll could shift the entire blame." He paused, letting the implication hang. "Let him go. I stay here until you're satisfied. If the scroll proves useful, you have my cooperation. If not, you know where to find me." The silence stretched. Dust motes danced in the slivers of dawn light cutting through the broken walls. Clerk Shen made a muffled sound against his gag, his eyes pleading. Li Chen kept his expression neutral, his body poised but not threatening. Every second the memory palace's aftereffects gnawed at him, a creeping weakness in his limbs. Finally, the tall assassin gave a curt nod. "Cut him loose." The assassin near Shen sliced through the ropes with a quick motion of his dagger. Shen stumbled to his feet, rubbing his wrists, his gaze darting between Li Chen and the assassins. "Go," Li Chen said quietly to Shen. "Don't look back. Report to the Ministry of Justice that you were detained by bandits. Say nothing of this." Shen needed no further urging. He scrambled past Li Chen, out the door, and into the morning light, his footsteps fading quickly. Li Chen remained, facing the three assassins. The tall one examined the scroll, then tucked it into his clothing. "We will verify this. If you've deceived us." "I know the consequences," Li Chen interrupted. He took a slow step backward, toward the doorway. His legs felt unsteady, but he willed them to hold. As he turned to leave, the assassin with the rope dart, the one who had been guarding Chen, moved closer. Not to attack, but to speak. His voice was a low, venomous whisper, meant for Li Chen's ears alone. The minister knows your every move. Li Chen froze, his hand on the doorframe. The assassin leaned in, his masked face inches away. Your family is next. Then he stepped back, melting into the shadows with the others. Li Chen stood alone in the doorway, the words echoing in his mind like a death knell. The threat was no longer vague, it was specific, immediate. They weren't just watching. They were planning. He stumbled out of the mill, the morning light now harsh to his exhausted eyes. The creek gurgled mockingly beside him. Somewhere in the distance, Clerk Shen was fleeing to safety, but Li Chen felt no relief. Only a cold, spreading dread. He had avoided a fight today, traded false evidence for a life. But the cost was a clearer warning: his family, Mei Lin, his children, were now explicit targets in this deadly game. He walked slowly away from the mill, each step heavier than the last. The forensic memory palace had left him hollowed out, his thoughts sluggish. He needed to rest, to recover. But there was no time. The Minister of War's net was tightening, and every move Li Chen made was being tracked. He had to warn Mei Lin, had to find a way to protect them. Yet how could he, when his own strength was failing, and his enemies seemed to anticipate his every action? The path back to the city stretched before him, long and exposed. He glanced over his shoulder once. The mill stood silent, empty now. But the whisper lingered in the air, a poison seeping into his resolve: your family is next. The inkstone sat dry on Li Chen's desk, its carved dragon motif gathering dust in the lamplight. For 3 days and nights, he had not left the small study in his government quarters, the air thick with the scent of old paper and the metallic tang of exhaustion. His eyes burned with the strain of constant focus, each blink a struggle against the weight pulling at his lids. Around him, the evidence had taken physical form: scrolls unrolled across the floor, wax rubbings of needle marks pinned to the walls, dried samples of the blue poison variant carefully sealed in porcelain jars. But the true evidence existed in the space behind his eyes, in the forensic memory palace that now felt less like a sanctuary and more like a prison of relentless detail. Li Chen leaned back in his chair, the wood groaning in protest. His fingers traced the edge of a wax rubbing taken from Assistant Minister Zhao's temple, the precise, circular indentation that matched the pressure point technique used in Grand Secretary Zhang's murder. In his mind's eye, he reconstructed the Temple of Heavenly Peace for the 100th time, the way the morning light had fallen through the lattice windows, casting geometric shadows across Zhao's silk-draped body, the faint scent of sandalwood incense that had masked the sharper odor of the toxin, the exact angle at which the needle had been inserted, calculated from the bruise patterns he'd memorized. 2 murders, he whispered to the empty room, his voice raspy from disuse. Same technique, different poison variants. He pushed himself up, his joints protesting with sharp pains. The exhaustion was no longer just fatigue, it had settled into his bones, a deep ache that made every movement feel like wading through mud. He walked to the wall where he'd pinned a map of connections, strings of red thread linking names and events. At the center sat the Minister of War, a black stone weight holding the web in place. But Li Chen's finger moved to a different name, one positioned carefully 2 steps removed, Undersecretary Wen of the Ministry of Justice. Wen had been the one to warn him about the audit. Wen had access to the evidence logs. Wen had been present when the first murder was reported, his demeanor just a shade too calm for a man witnessing a supposed supernatural horror. Li Chen closed his eyes, activating the forensic memory palace once more despite the wave of dizziness that followed. The mental space unfolded, not a crime scene this time, but a series of interactions: Wen's hands as they passed documents, the slight tremor when Li Chen mentioned the blue poison variant, Wen's eyes darting toward the door during their last conversation, as if expecting someone, the way he'd phrased his warning about the Minister of War, not as concern but as a subtle probe for what Li Chen knew. Enough, Li Chen murmured, opening his eyes to the real world. Not the minister. Not yet. But one. One is the thread I can pull. He returned to his desk, pulling fresh paper from a drawer. The brush felt heavy in his hand, the weight of what he was about to do settling in his chest. For hours, he wrote, each character meticulously formed, each piece of evidence referenced with exacting precision. He described the pressure point technique without naming its martial origins. He detailed the poison variants without tracing them to their noble cultivators. He presented the connections between the murders without ever mentioning the Minister of War. And always, he circled back to Undersecretary Wen's unexplained presence at both murder scenes during the initial investigations, Wen's access to the evidence that had gone missing from the Ministry of Justice archives, Wen's sudden wealth in recent months, evidenced by the new jade pendant he'd begun wearing, a pendant Li Chen had mentally reconstructed from memory, noting the exact carving pattern that matched tribute items from a province known for cultivating the blue poison. Variant's base ingredient. As dawn approached on the fourth day, Li Chen set down his brush. The report lay before him, 37 pages of flawless logic, each conclusion supported by 3 separate pieces of evidence, each piece of evidence documented in ways that could be verified without revealing his memory palace cheat. He had created a case so airtight that even the Minister of War's faction would struggle to dismantle it, because dismantling it would require admitting knowledge they shouldn't possess. A knock at the door made him startle, his hand instinctively covering the report. "Investigator Li," came a voice from the hallway, one of the junior clerks from the Ministry of Justice. "The Deputy Minister of Personnel requests your presence. The trial preparations for Undersecretary Wen begin at noon." Li Chen's breath caught. They had moved faster than he anticipated. He had submitted the report only yesterday evening, through channels he thought would take days to process. Someone had expedited it. Someone wanted Wen dealt with quickly. "Tell him I'll be there," Li Chen called back, his voice steadier than he felt. He dressed carefully, choosing his formal investigator's robes, dark blue with silver threading at the cuffs, the colors of imperial authority. Each movement was deliberate, each fold of fabric smoothed with hands that trembled only slightly. He tucked the original report into an inner pocket, then placed a copy in the locked drawer of his desk. The key he swallowed, the metal cold and sharp going down. The walk to the Hall of Heavenly Justice should have taken 15 minutes. Li Chen made it in 25, his steps measured, his eyes taking in every detail of the palace corridors, the way the morning light filtered through paper windows, casting long shadows, the distant sound of court musicians practicing for some upcoming ceremony, the scent of plum blossoms from the imperial gardens, sweet and cloying. He paused at the great doors of the hall, their red lacquer gleaming in the sun. Through the carved screens, he could see figures moving inside, judges in their black robes, clerks arranging documents, guards standing at attention with their halberds gleaming. And there, in the center of the room, stood Undersecretary Wen, his hands bound behind him, his face pale but composed. Li Chen took a deep breath, the air tasting of incense and anticipation. This was the move he had calculated for weeks: expose a mid-level conspirator, create a public spectacle that would make targeting his family too risky, buy time to gather evidence against the true powers. Every forensic detail, every reconstructed memory, every sleepless night had led to this moment. He pushed the doors open. The trial lasted 6 hours. Li Chen presented his evidence with calm precision, his voice never rising, his gestures economical. He showed the wax rubbings, displayed the poison samples in their sealed jars, referenced witness testimonies he had collected from temple priests and palace servants. When Wen's defender, a lawyer from the Minister of War's faction, tried to challenge the poison origins, Li Chen produced documentation showing the blue poison variant's base ingredient could be purchased legally in 3 different markets. When they questioned Wen's motive, Li Chen presented records of gambling debts paid off suddenly, of a mistress housed in a neighborhood Wen's salary shouldn't afford. And through it all, Li Chen watched Wen's face. He saw the moment when realized he had been chosen as the sacrifice, the flicker of betrayal in his eyes, the tightening of his jaw. Wen looked toward the observers' gallery once, where several high-ranking nobles sat in shadowed alcoves. No one met his gaze. When the head judge pronounced the verdict, guilty of conspiracy to commit murder, execution scheduled for 3 days hence, the hall remained eerily silent. No one cheered. No one protested. It was as if the entire court had been holding its breath and now didn't know whether to exhale. Li Chen collected his documents as clerks swarmed around Wen, leading him away. The other officials began filing out, their robes rustling like dried leaves. None approached Li Chen. None offered congratulations or condolences. He was a stone dropped into a pond, and everyone was waiting to see what ripples would follow. He returned to his quarters as evening fell, the weight of the day settling into his shoulders. He should have felt triumph. He had done exactly what he set out to do, created a public record, secured temporary safety for his family, moved one piece closer to the truth. But all he felt was the exhaustion, deeper now, a well with no bottom. He lit a single lamp, the flame dancing in the draft from the window. Outside, the first stars were appearing in the purpling sky. He thought of Mei Lin, of Feng and his other children, safe in the relocated house he had arranged through trusted contacts. He thought of the dead sparrow on his doorstep, of the assassin's whisper, "Your family is next." For the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe they might be safe. Wen's public conviction would make further threats too obvious, too risky. The conspirators would need to regroup, to reassess. It bought time. It bought breathing room. He was reaching for the teapot when he heard the first sound, not at the door, but from outside, in the narrow alley behind his quarters. A soft scrape, like leather on stone. Then another. And another. Li Chen moved to the window, keeping to the shadows. He peered through the lattice into the gathering dark. Figures moved in the alley, not the usual night watchmen with their lanterns, but darker shapes, silent and purposeful. They took positions at both ends of the alley, their forms blending into the architecture. Then more figures appeared on the rooftops opposite, crouched low, their outlines sharp against the twilight sky. He counted 12. Then 15. All wearing dark clothing, all moving with the disciplined silence of professional guards. They weren't attacking. They were surrounding. Forming a perimeter around his quarters and the small attached residence where his family was supposed to be safe. Li Chen's breath caught in his throat. The relocation had been secret. Only 3 people knew the location. He had chosen it precisely because it was unremarkable, because no one would think to look there. A soft tap came at his study door, not the bold knock of an official, but the hesitant tap of someone trying not to be heard. Li Chen crossed the room, his heart pounding against his ribs. He opened the door a crack. One of his household servants stood there, a boy of maybe 14, his face pale in the lamplight. In his hands he held a small scroll, the paper crumpled as if clutched tightly during a run. "Master," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "This came from the mistress. She said to give it only to you, no matter who asks." Li Chen took the scroll, his fingers cold. He unrolled it, the characters written in Mei Lin's hurried hand, the ink smudged in places as if written in darkness or haste. Asterisk, "They found us. Not the watchers from before, new ones, in uniform. 20 at least. Surrounding the house. Feng saw them changing guards at moonrise. They're not hiding anymore. They're here, asterisk. They're here." The boy was still standing there, waiting for instructions. From outside came the sound of a boot shifting on gravel, deliberately loud this time. A signal. Li Chen looked from the scroll to the window, where dark shapes now blocked the alley completely. The flawless case, the public trial, the calculated exposure of one, none of it had mattered. They hadn't needed to threaten quietly anymore. They had simply come. And as he stood there, the report that had seemed so perfect hours ago now felt like ashes in his mouth, the words, "They're here," echoing in the silent room like a death sentence pronounced not in a hall of justice, but in the dark of his own home. The hall of heavenly justice was a cavern of carved stone and judgment. Morning light filtered through high lattice windows, cutting diagonal shafts through the incense haze that coiled around the carved dragon pillars. The air smelled of sandalwood and the faint, metallic tang of anticipation. Li Chen stood at the center of the polished black floor, his official robes, deep blue with silver trim, hanging slightly loose on his frame. 3 days and nights without proper sleep had carved hollows beneath his eyes, and a deep, bone-level ache pulsed behind his temples, a constant reminder of the forensic memory palace's price. Yet he stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back, fingers tracing the subtle seam of a hidden pocket where he kept his notes. To his left, on a raised dais, sat the 3 presiding magistrates in crimson robes, their faces impassive masks of authority. The chief magistrate, an elderly man with a beard like frost-dusted silk, held a jade tablet. To his right, the accused, undersecretary one of the Ministry of Justice, knelt in chains, his head bowed, his once proud shoulders slumped. Wen's face was pale, sweat beading on his brow despite the hall's chill. Around them, the gallery was packed with court officials, nobles, and scribes, a sea of embroidered silks and watchful eyes. Li Chen could feel their gazes like needles against his skin. Among them, he spotted the Minister of War standing near a pillar, his expression unreadable, his hands tucked into wide sleeves. The Empress's brother did not smile, but his presence was a cold weight in the room. Behind Li Chen, at the hall's entrance, 2 uniformed guards stood rigid. They were not his. They wore the insignia of the palace guard, and their presence was a silent scream. His family's relocated home was surrounded by 20 such men. Meilin's frantic message, delivered by a trembling servant before dawn, echoed in his mind. They found us. The guards are everywhere. The children are terrified. Li Chen had read it once, then burned it, the ash staining his fingers. Now, as he faced the court, that ash seemed to coat his throat. He had gambled that exposing one would draw attention away from his family, that a public conviction would act as a shield. The guards proved him wrong. The conspiracy was deeper, bolder. They were not hiding, they were encircling. The chief magistrate's voice cut through the murmurs. Imperial Investigator Li Chen. You have presented a case against Undersecretary Wen, accusing him of conspiracy in the Ghost Silk murders. The court awaits your evidence. Proceed. The words were formal, but Li Chen heard the edge in them. This was not just a trial, it was a performance for the entire court, and every noble here knew the stakes. If Li Chen faltered, if his evidence cracked, one would walk free, and Li Chen's family would be next. The Minister of War's gaze felt like a physical touch. Li Chen took a slow breath, the air cool in his lungs. He had rehearsed this moment in his mind 100 times, but now, with exhaustion gnawing at his thoughts, he had to rely on the one thing that never failed him, the forensic memory palace. He stepped forward, his boots whispering on the stone. Esteemed magistrates, he began, his voice steady despite the fatigue. The Ghost Silk murders have haunted this court with whispers of spirits and curses. But I stand before you today to prove they are works of mortal hands, of poison, pressure, and political design. He paused, letting the words settle. A ripple went through the gallery. Some leaned forward, others exchanged glances. Li Chen continued. My evidence begins with the murder of Assistant Minister Zhao in the Temple of Heavenly Peace. Closing his eyes for a moment, he activated the forensic memory palace. The hall around him blurred, the sounds fading to a distant hum. In his mind, the Temple of Heavenly Peace reconstructed itself with perfect, agonizing clarity. He saw the incense-heavy air, the body of Assistant Minister Zhao draped in cursed silk, the faint needle marks on his neck. He felt the chill of the stone floor, smelled the metallic hint of blood mixed with sandalwood. The memory palace unfolded like a scroll, each detail sharp and immutable. He had visited that scene weeks ago, and now, he walked through it again in his mind. The mental exertion was immediate, a sharp spike of pain behind his eyes, as if a hot wire were being threaded through his skull. His stamina, already drained from overuse, trembled. But he pushed through, forcing the images to hold. Opening his eyes, he addressed the court. Assistant Minister Zhao was found exsanguinated, with no visible wounds. Supernatural rumor claimed a ghostly silk wraith. Yet, in my examination, I noted 2 nearly invisible punctures at the base of his neck, each no wider than a hair. He produced a small scroll from his sleeve, unrolling it to show a detailed sketch drawn from his memory palace reconstruction. The magistrates leaned in. These punctures matched the use of fine needles, dipped in a rare toxin derived from blue-spotted lotus, a poison that causes rapid blood loss without leaving external marks. The silk was a diversion, draped post-mortem to fuel fear. He moved on, his voice gaining strength as he wove the narrative. This toxin was cultivated in the gardens of the rival noble house, as confirmed by soil samples I obtained discreetly. He did not mention how he had nearly been caught retrieving those samples, or how the memory palace had shown him the exact layout of the garden, the guards' patrol patterns. The mental effort was relentless, sweat trickled down his spine, and his vision wavered at the edges. He focused on the chief magistrate's face, using it as an anchor. Undersecretary Wen, Li Chen said, turning to the accused. You were seen meeting with a known agent of that noble house 3 days before Assistant Minister Zhao's murder. Your own ledger, recovered from your quarters, shows payments for special herbs, a euphemism for the blue-spotted lotus extract. He presented the ledger, a worn book with entries in neat, small characters. The memory palace had shown him where it was hidden, behind a loose brick in Wen's study. Li Chen had reconstructed the scene after a brief, sanctioned search, noting the dust patterns, the slight discoloration of the mortar. Now, he described it to the court, each detail precise. The brick was slightly warmer than the others, suggesting recent disturbance. The ledger inside bore your seal, Undersecretary. Wen looked up, his eyes wide with panic. That is fabricated. I never. Li Chen cut him off, his tone calm but inexorable. The ink on the relevant entries is fresher than the surrounding pages. Under magnification, one can see the fibers of the paper are less compressed, indicating recent addition. He had not used magnification, he had used the memory palace to compare the texture mentally, a feat that made his head throb. But the court did not need to know that. They needed certainty. He called a witness, Clerk Shen, the minor official he had rescued from the abandoned mill. Shen entered, trembling, his face pale. He confirmed seeing Wen receive a package from a masked courier the night before Zhao's murder. Shen's testimony was halting, but it matched the timeline Li Chen had reconstructed. Then came the most damning evidence. Li Chen presented a vial of blue-tinged liquid. This is a sample of the toxin, recovered from Wen's private laboratory. It matches the residue found on Assistant Minister Zhao's neck. In truth, Li Chen had obtained the vial from the rival noble house's garden during his investigation, but he had planted a trace amount in Wen's lab using the memory palace to ensure no one saw him. The mental image of that night, slipping through shadows, his heart pounding, flashed in his mind, fresh and vivid. The exhaustion deepened, a heavy fog threatening to swallow his thoughts. He gripped the edge of the evidence table, his knuckles white. For 6 hours, Li Chen laid out his case. He used the forensic memory palace to recall every detail, the pressure point techniques used on Grand Secretary Zhang, reconstructed from the faint bruising pattern, the silk fibers traced to a specific weaver in the Ministry of Rights, the witness testimonies cross-referenced with palace records. Each reconstruction was a mental strain, pulling at his already frayed stamina. He felt as if he were balancing on a razor's edge, one misstep away from collapse. But he did not falter. He presented a flawless 37-page case, each page backed by forensic analysis that left no room for supernatural excuses. The court listened in rapt silence. Even the Minister of War's expression tightened, a flicker of something, anger. Respect, in his eyes. When Li Chen finished, the hall was utterly still. The chief magistrate conferred with his colleagues, their whispers like dry leaves. Then the verdict came. Undersecretary Wen is found guilty of conspiracy in the Ghost Silk murders. The sentence is execution by beheading, to be carried out at dawn. A collective exhale swept the gallery. Wen screamed, begging for mercy, but the guards dragged him away. Li Chen did not watch. His knees felt weak, the ache in his bones now a roaring tide. He had done it. He had exposed a conspirator, turned forensic evidence into a political trap, and, he hoped, secured temporary safety for his family. The chief magistrate stood. Imperial Investigator Li Chen, your diligence has served the Empire well. For your service, you are promoted to Senior Investigator of the first rank, with authority over all supernatural inquiries in the capital. Applause echoed through the hall, polite but genuine. Nobles approached to offer congratulations, their smiles not quite reaching their eyes. Li Chen accepted them mechanically, his mind already racing. The promotion was a shield, a public acknowledgement that made him harder to target directly. But the guards around his family's home still stood. As the crowd began to disperse, Li Chen allowed himself a moment of relief. He found a quiet corner near a pillar, leaning against the cool stone. The exhaustion was a physical weight now, but beneath it, a fragile hope stirred. Perhaps the trial had worked. Perhaps the conspirators would retreat, regroup. He thought of Mei Lin and the children, imagining their faces when they heard the news. He would visit them tonight, reassure them. Then a shadow fell across him. Li Chen looked up. The Minister of War stood before him, his broad frame blocking the light from the window. He wore robes of dark green embroidered with silver phoenixes, the mark of his rank. His face was composed, but his eyes were cold, like chips of winter ice. He did not offer congratulations. Instead, he leaned in slightly, his voice a low murmur that carried only to Li Chen's ears. A clever performance, Investigator. The words were soft, almost admiring, but the tone was edged with frost. You reconstructed every detail so perfectly. One might think you were there yourself. He paused, letting the implication hang, a veiled reference to the memory palace, perhaps, or simply the precision of the evidence. Then he smiled, a thin, cold curve of his lips that never touched his eyes. But the game is far from over. I'll be watching. He stepped back, gave a slight nod that was more threat than courtesy, and melted into the departing crowd. Li Chen stood frozen, the fragile hope shattering like glass. The ache in his bones sharpened, and for a moment, the hall seemed to tilt around him. The Minister of War's words echoed in the silence left behind, a promise and a warning. The game was far from over. And now, the most powerful player in it was watching him, closer than ever.